Trying again. And then let's see if the chat box will fucking work. Who knows? Oh, I don't have my stream jewelry on. Let me do that also. Hello! Let me get my stream stuff. I'm unprepared, I'm sorry. Hello! Yay, it works. Thought it was Tuesday. I mean, considering that is usually, but you know, I wanted to get to read some more. Also, I hurt my knee. Not sure. It's like I just fucking stood weird. Happy birthday, Maple. Aw, thank you. But yeah, I like stood or like took a weird step and now my fucking knee hurts. So that's awesome. I love that for me. What's the most valuable kind of knee? Oh boy, what? What is it? Let's get our water. I'm also gonna take some Advil because my head hurts a little bit. Money. Amazing. Ugh. Ugh. God damn. Quit your toxic job today after 2 months. Damn. Well, hey, good for you, and hopefully you're able to find another one in a reasonable amount of time. Oh, thank you, Maple. Yeah, I think my head should be fine after taking some Advil. Strong like a bull. Yeah. Urgh. Now we get the water. You want your mail to get here? So hypnotic you can't even find me. You're so entranced that you can't even see me. A coin flip? Who left that there? Wow, that's so crazy. also got some chips. Ow. Yeah, I don't know how to make my knee not fucking hurt, but whatever, it's okay. Okay, first things first, let's take some Advil. You watch my hypno videos all the time? Hell yeah, I'm glad you enjoy them. Oh, that's some good water. Also, my hair is all nice and floofy. We love to see it. Okay, coin flip, and then we'll start reading. So, for those of you who weren't here last Thursday, I started reading, what's it fucking called? Morning Glory Milking Farm, which is about milking minotaurs. So we're on like chapter 6. The VOD for that should still be on YouTube and such, so if you want to catch up, there you go. Anyway, whoop. Almost hit my fucking screen. Oh well, fuck. You have a difficult time relaxing most days, and when you see my videos, it's easy to relax to them. I'm glad to hear that. I always stream while you're at work. Oh, sorry about that. Well, I'm glad that you're able to pop in anyway, and I appreciate the gifts. It is a Monday, which is unusual for me, but I was eager to continue. Can you blame me? I think you guys are eager to continue also. Okay. Put this here. Okay, and I can use this to change pages. It's not Monday, it's Tuesday. That's it. That's what it is. Gotta go. Bye. Okay. We begin. Oh, thank you, Shadow. The Black Sheep Beanery was bustling as she stepped through the door the following afternoon, the smell of coffee reaching her before she'd even crossed the street. Violet felt a flare of nerves at being the only human in the room that she could see, feeling vulnerable without the protective coverings that her scrub at the farm provided. Half of Cambric Creek seemed to be packed into the tight space, goblins and trolls and elves and gnolls, crowding around low tables and high tops, laughing over steaming paper cups as they pressed into armchairs, and standing at the long oak bar. She let out a rugged breath as she hesitantly joined the queue, half wishing she'd stuck to the coffee shop in the little strip mall. The sheep-faced man working the espresso machine never looked up from the line of labeled cups before him. His long dreadlocks gathered in a neat tie at the nape of his neck, swinging down his back as he efficiently added foamed milk to the tops of several of the cups before they were capped by an ivory-skinned elf who called out the names on the labels for the waiting patrons. Beside them, a tiefling with curling horns manned the cold drinks, shaking teas and iced lattes as if she were slinging high-end cocktails. She watched as a sleek, scaled lizard woman claimed her cup once her name was called, barking into her cell phone the whole time, and Violet's eyes tracked her progress through the press of bodies, squeezing past a towering orc in a white lab coat and disappearing at the door. The man in the queue ahead of her might have been human, she realized, studying his broad, well-muscled back, encased in a snug blue polo, tucked into uniform pants of the same color. The cashier was laughing at the conversation they had as she passed him his receipt, and as Violet watched, an employee from the back room The back room? Oh my god! Carried out 2 carafe boxes, passing them over the counter to the dark-haired man. See, you're not the odd human out. It's fine. No one here even cares about that, probably. When he turned, she had a smile ready, eager for the solidarity of shared specieshood, but there was something in the man's eye that made her shrink, her smile fading away. He was ridiculously handsome, his thick dark hair matched by his bittersweet chocolate eyes, a square jaw with a wide mouth, automatically turning up in a grin, a dimple appearing in his cheek. But the silver gleam in those dark eyes marked him as something other, more in common with the elves and goblins than her. His polo bore the emblem of the local firehouse, she saw, her eyes dropping, heat warming her cheeks as he nodded to her, the blinding white of his teeth obliterating everything else in the room. "There's cream and sugar in the bag trap," the ewe-faced woman behind the counter said as he waved. The dreadlocked man behind the counter called out his own goodbye to the man before turning back to his espresso machine. "What can we get for you today?" Violet realized with a jolt that there was no one in front of her before the till, and that the smiling ewe-faced woman, like the animal, waited expectantly. She'd been so wrapped up in watching the non-human resident, she'd never glanced up to the menu, realizing too late that she had no idea what she wanted to order. The menu above was huge, she saw with a sinking heart, huge and unfamiliar, full of strange-sounding options that catered to the varied clientele. Her eyes zigzagged back and forth over menu items, absorbing none of it. That's a fucking mood. Her ability to read fleeing in her panic. Her brain seemed to freeze, grasping for something to blurt. Her normal coffee order in the city, the mucky drink she'd tried at the little strip mall shop. Anything at all that might break her muteness, but her mouth came up empty. "Just say something." Is this your first time here?" The woman behind the counter asked kindly, perhaps intuiting that the human for her had completely lost her grasp of the common tongue, too wrapped up in gawking to even manage basic speech, smiling gently when Violet nodded with a flush. "Gee, is it that obvious?" "The honeycomb latte is the most popular thing on our menu. That's what I'd recommend. It's our house espresso roast, and the honeycomb comes from one of the local farms." "Honey, that sounds perfect," she sagged in relief, face burning in mortification, thankful for the woman's patience. "I'll try that, thank you." The little shop might need to be an only once-in-a-while luxury, she thought, after swiping her card, the charge she'd just added to her bank card being pricier than even the chain near her apartment with the burnt coffee. The pickup area was a press of bodies, small goblins and huge ogres, a graceful deer woman and a harpy with iridescent black feathers. The noise level was near deafening, and Violet felt herself shrink, feeling awkward and out of place, wondering why she thought this was a good idea. She was going to find a corner to hide in, planned to grab her coffee and leave the moment her name was called, when an arm slipped through hers. A heady hush of perfume invaded her nostrils, bright white flowers and thick patchouli. I think that's how it's said. The arm tugging her close with determined strength, the clack and slide of several dozen bangles pressing into her forearm where she was gripped. "Here you are, love. Come on, I got us a table already." The girl's hair was bleached with a silvery platinum blonde, spiky and shaved around her right ear, swinging along and silky past her left shoulder. Her piercing blue eyes were heavily lined in black with frosty white shadow, and they fixed on Violet with a heated intensity. She had no idea who this strange woman was, nor why she was acting like they were old acquaintances, but allowed herself to be pulled by the arm, too elated not to be the only human in attendance to care as the girl weaved through the packed pickup area until they reached a tiny crescent of empty table, the spilled-out contents of a well-worn black shoulder bag holding it for their arrival. For the next 7 minutes she listened to the chattering woman tell an animated story about a man named Byron and his lack of common sense, his terrible sense of direction, and his inexplicable fear of water bears. "Hello, I'm doing good." "I swear to fucking Dagda, I don't understand how anyone can be that thick after an extra 140 years to sort themselves." Violet nodded, utterly engrossed, despite not having any idea who Byron was, who this woman was, or why she was acting as if they were old friends, nor what an extra 140 years even meant. Her name was called at that moment by the elf at the counter, her eyes darting to the steaming cup that had been placed at the pickup station amid half-dozen others, and back to her unlikely companion, uncertain if she was allowed to leave. "Is that you, Violet?" The girl stretched in her seat, craning her neck to see around the cluster of patrons at the bar, sagging in relief a moment later. Perfect timing that. He's gone. "Would you be a lovey and snag mine while you're up there? It's the lavender Earl Grey for Gilly." Despite her earlier self-consciousness, Violet settled into her seat, the non-stop chatter and hum of the perpetually busy coffee shop settling into a pleasant white noise as she sipped her drink and listened to the girl. Her name was Gellius, and her pedestrian life as a university student had ended the night she was turned outside of a London concert hall in 1902. Violet had never met a vampire before, hadn't considered that vampires might be out and about in the middle of the day or drinking tea, had certainly never dreamt that she'd be shanghaied by one, but she savored the velvety smoothness of her drink, the rich, malty coffee sweetened with a thick cutting of golden honeycomb and turned rich with cream. Listening to the girl's heavily accented patter, she was incredibly grateful that she had been. "Sorry about all that waffle. Thanks a ton for playing along." I don't know what accent she's supposed to have, so we're just going. "I hate running into folks from work outside the context, you know?" She nodded again, pretending that she had any commensurate experience with that sort of thing, imagining the oddly dressed vampire to be some sort of businesswoman, not wanting to make small talk with the boss on her off hours. "Did one of your co-workers come in?" "Not strictly speaking, one of our donors. It's one thing to keep them entertained while you're draining them, another to have to suffer a chin wag on your own time. If that numpty-headed Byron had come in, I'd have—" "Donors?" Violet interrupted, unable to help herself, straightening in her seat. Her stomach flip-flopped at Gaelis's words, trying to imagine making small talk with one of the good little cows in the coffee line. What do you mean? Donors? Draining them? Right, at the restaurant. You ought to come by sometime. There's a side menu for you bleeders. That sounds like it would definitely be a fucking slur in this universe. You bleeders. So everyone is happy. The whole menu is ethically sourced. Ennis likes us to call it. The donors are screened every 2 weeks, no smoking, no drugs, clean eating for the duration of their contracts. About half of them are an easy go, just hook up the lines and have a chat. It's the other half you have to bloody worry over. Think the second the needle goes into their skin is the perfect time to have a wank. It's a fetish, being a feeder bleeder. Half the time they've got their pants open before I even get the tourniquet out. Violet gaped. The girl was so matter-of-fact, so blasé about the tawdrier aspects of her apparent job, a job that sounded suspiciously similar to Violet's own. Okay, wait. Start over. Tell me everything. La Vie Rouge was a vampire-centric restaurant in Camber Creek's business district, she learned, catering to a fanged patronage, with a small menu of charcuterie boards and fruit plates for the regular clientele's dinner guests. The proprietor, Ennis, had been a banker in his previous life, a respected member of his Victorian community with a wife and several children before he'd been turned by a member of his church, a man with whom he'd had several sexual dalliances. Gaelis told the story in a hushed voice, leaning over her cup of tea with bright, expressive eyes, and Violet was certain she could smell the petrichor from the rainy night she described, could see the steam rising off the pavement beneath the yellow glow of gas lamps as a man was bitten during a clandestine back-alley assignation. The numpty-headed Byron was his partner, clinically inept and a disgrace to vampires everywhere, according to Gaelis. I'm telling you, he must be bloody fucking brilliant in bed. That's the only reason I can think of for Ennis to have decided... Watcher. I have the whole world to pick from, but this gormless muppet is me true love. It's the only explanation. And you take the blood from the menu donors? Violet went on, undeterred, a bubble of giddiness rising within her. And sometimes they're jerking off? The two goblins at the adjacent table paused their conversation to glance up at her enthusiastic exclamation as an orc at the table across from theirs raised a thick, dark eyebrow, a smile tugging at the corner of his full lips around his tusks. Heat burned up her neck, but she was too excited to be mortified. She has a job just like yours. Before the vampire could even respond, Violet was continuing, overwhelmed with the need to get it all out, to tell someone, to tell her everything. I work at Morning Glory Milking Farm. Have you heard of it? We milk minotaurs. That's my job. I'm a milking technician. Gellius's mouth formed a perfect O of surprise for several beats before her darkly lined lips broke into a wolfish smile, showing off her pointed canines. Minotaurs don't have udders, not that I'm aware of, so what exactly is it you're milking? Violet didn't need to answer, for the other girl had already dissolved into laughter, her platinum head dropping to the table. Well, that's the best gig in town, isn't it? You at least get to work with big, beefy minotaurs. I'm stuck with humans. I'll bet that's some prime beef you get to manhandle. Grade A certified, she giggled, elation wiping out the previous afternoon's melancholy. Can you believe that's a job? Although I never would have guessed being a literal menu item was a job either. I love it here. It's so different from everything I'm used to. The job pays really well, so I have no complaints. Cheers to that, the smiling vampire said, raising her paper cup. This town is full of some odd ducks, but it's nice having neighbors who aren't rounding up pitchforks over every little thing. I can complain about Byron until crack-a-damn, but Ennis and the restaurant, it's a good place to be. Promise you'll come by sometime. Hello. Violet tapped her nearly empty cup against the side of the other girl's, beaming. She did want to visit the vampire restaurant, wanted to get a glimpse of the infamous Byron and learn what sorts of dishes were on the menu for the vampire clientele. She wanted to see what the intriguing little shop was with the stained glass windows and learn what a talon dip entailed at the nail salon. Wanted to explore all the interesting corners of Cambric Creek, which to her would be all of it. There was nothing like this back home in her human neighborhood. Nothing like this eclectic little coffee shop, catering to all the different members of the community, and she'd certainly never had a chance to befriend a vampire if she were sitting there making stilted conversation with Carson Tinsley from up the street. She was glad she'd met Gellius. Glad she'd made the time to come, Violet decided. He was right. It was worth it. Chapter 7. Just like that, right there. That's what I like. Don't stop now, sugar. You keep that up. She grimaced from her place beneath the breeding bench, glancing down at the digital clock on the table. She'd worked on this bull before, and heard stories from the other collection techs. He wasn't quite one of the good little cows. Didn't need the fantasy of being milked like an actual dairy heifer, but it was clear he was there for the hand job. Violet was half convinced he'd not notice if his bottle was never scanned in, no payment routing to his account. He came for the sexual release and didn't let the associate under the bench forget it. She nearly lost her grip as the minotaur above shifted, repositioning himself to be able to thrust harder against the hole in the bench. She had no doubt that he was likely a terrible lover, if the sharp, erratic bobs of his cock were any indication. Being on the receiving end of that would be like getting a root canal. Squeeze my balls with your other hand, but keep that up now. Perfect. You're gonna have me coming so hard. The timer on the table rolled over to the 15-minute mark, which was good enough for her. Reaching back, she flipped on the machine one-handed and took up the nozzle. If he wanted to talk about ejaculating, there was no time like the present. The minotaur jerked when she applied the nozzle, his protest turning to a groan as the sucking silicone worked down his shaft, and she peeled off the oil-coated gloves, writing the label. She'd been working at the farm for several months at this point, and while clients like this might have fazed her in the beginning, they did so no longer. There we go, she agreed as the green light clicked on. She'd not been earning a tip from this particular bull now, but then again, she likely wouldn't have anyway. Get them in and out, and on with their day. There was a good little cow in her rotation that afternoon, bookended with earners, and she only hoped the day would pass quickly. A purple sticker loomed on the bottom of her stack of files, and thus every hour before the one that signified her last appointment of the day was merely there to be endured. Oh, it's her man. It's her Minotaur. He visited the farm on Fridays, and had confided that he liked to do so because he often traveled for work on the weekends. She had no idea what line of work he was in, nor what his travel entailed, and if she was being completely honest with herself, his confidence had been more of a matter-of-fact declaration, and she needed to suppress the urge to snap to attention with a notebook, taking dictation as he towered above her. That hadn't stopped her from using the small bits of information she gleaned to pad her daydreams with solidity, each tiny nugget adding to the shape of him in her mind. The information on his chart was minimal. He weighed almost as much as her compact car and was more than a decade her senior. Violet pondered if he would find her too young to be a viable romantic partner, if their disparate social positions would be a turnoff. After all, he's obviously successful. 3 months ago, you had to buy a gas station coffee and generic orange juice. She'd been sipping her juice before her laptop when the thought had occurred to her, scowling at the voice in her head. She still bought the generic orange juice, but now she did so because she found she preferred the taste, she rationalized. She wasn't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot, but for the first time since she'd been out on her own, her bank account had a 4-digit balance. She'd been able to set her credit card bills to autopay, a luxury reserved for only those who always knew where their next dollar was coming from, and didn't need to stress over having money for basic necessities. She was still in debt and drinking generic juice, nowhere on his lofty level, but she was holding her own. And besides, she reminded herself peevishly, she was well educated and highly motivated. She only needed the right opportunity to come along before her own career would be underway. She wondered if he worked in one of the nearby industrial parks, as he'd mentioned coming to his appointments with her from work, and she deduced from their previous conversations that he obviously lived in Cambric Creek. He'd once lived in Bridgeton, but he'd clearly stated that he used to live in the city. She wondered where he'd called home then, if he'd lived in one of the expensive high-rises around the downtown area, or something more akin to her own dilapidated little building, full of pensioners and cash-strapped students. She'd looked up Starling Heights, discovering it was another town, separated from Cambric Creek by Greenbridge Glen, a tiny resort community nestled in rolling green hills. He didn't live in the resort town, of that she was certain, and he'd complained about the distance to Starling Heights, which made Cambric Creek the most likely option. She detoured off the main road on her way home one afternoon, turning down streets until she found herself in the residential section of town, housing development after housing development of tidy properties. The architecture had enough variation to keep the streets from looking identical, but there was clearly a city planning commission, and she wondered what the homeowners association fees must be. The second time she'd eschewed her direct route home, Violet noticed a theme. There wasn't simply a difference in the generic architecture of the homes. There was distinctly different builds that boasted the same features repeatedly, over and over. The houses with extra-wide paved driveways also had outsized doorways, while other houses had no drive to speak of, just a wide expanse of green lawn and visible water features. Single-level dwellings that boasted no front steps sat beside more traditional-looking houses with extremely small doors. Some yards boasted thick, lush grass, and others were partially covered with sand. The coffee shop wasn't the only aspect of the town that catered to its varied residents, clearly. She tried to imagine what sort of house he lived in, if the residents moved into homes based on their species or had things custom-tailored after the fact. Beyond the endless streets of developments was a gated road bearing elvish lettering she was unable to read, the homes contained within sitting beyond an artificial slope, protecting them from looky-loos like her. Her return drive took her through a neighborhood called Old Town, as evidenced by the ornate placards on either side of the intersection, and, true to its name, the streets were lined with stately Victorians and palatial edifices that looked like something out of a movie set in the roaring 20s, and she'd been breathless with excitement over such a find, feeling her pulse race for reasons that had nothing to do with the corresponding beat between her thighs. for the first time in weeks. Her art history degree had funneled into a specific discipline, Western architecture of the previous 2 centuries, and ornamental hallmarks of the different styles. Her master's degree in nonprofit management had been meant to be the finishing block on the staircase to her dream job, and to be surrounded by such a bounty, she would have gladly given her left foot to get a look inside one of the pristine houses lining the street. She'd pulled to the curb in wonder, trying and failing to imagine what sort of residents lived there, unable to picture her minotaur. Her minotaur, ooh. Calling one of these Queen Anne's home. He seemed a touch too rugged for that, even with his well-pressed shirts. She'd not run into him wandering the streets of Cambric Creek, but the different neighborhoods fueled her fantasies all the same. According to his chart at the farm, he had been born in the dead of winter, mid-January, when the temperatures were coldest and the snow piled high. She'd never put much stock into horoscopes before, but now found herself curled up in bed at night with her tablet, reading about the responsible, serious natures possessed by Capricorns, distant and driven, with a healthy respect for material security and tremendous libido. Violet didn't pretend to know the first thing about astrology, but she was forced to admit the description seemed accurate, at least from what she could tell with her limited knowledge base. She'd never given much thought to her own sun sign, but the fact that her spring birthday was represented by a bull thrilled her. Of course it did. And she pored over new age websites reading about their sexual and emotional compatibility and chances for relationship success. Oh, she's got it bad. She wondered if other species read horoscopes or if it was a uniquely human distraction, deciding she'd ask Gellius. She had no doubt that his sober, stern nature meant that he would scoff at her ditherings, but it warmed her knowing that their compatibility was written in the stars. She had it bad. Oh, that's what I said. She tried her hardest to avoid it, to prevent it from happening, had even considered that she should go home for a weekend and have coffee with Carson Tinsley from up the street, but there was no way around it. She had a ridiculous crush on the messy-haired Minotaur, and every week spent in his gruff company pulled her further down, unable to think of anything but him. Going over every conversation they'd had over the past few months in an effort to root out the most innocuous details she might have overlooked. "Violet, I have good news and bad news," called Doxana. Donoxa, the cheerful beetle woman who had handled the files with Magda, appearing at the top of the hallway as she exited the collection room. In an instant, her heart seemed to climb to her throat, thoughts of her ridiculous crush replaced with the very real fear of being fired. "Violet, we know about your inappropriate fantasies. The janitorial staff has notified us of a snail trail left behind on your workbench. Please collect your things." "What do you want to hear first?" The bad, I guess," she squeaked out, hoping her knees would continue to hold her. "This is it. This is the end. No more delicious coffee and being friends with vampires. You're gonna need to move home. You'll have to marry Carson Tinsley and move into his mom's basement and take vacations in the loft above the garage." "Well, the bad news is your next appointment is cancelled. He called about an hour ago." She had curled in on herself, anticipating the blow of being told to collect her things, to leave immediately, and her eyes had scrunched tight, her hands gripping the stack of files with white knuckles. At Donoxa's words, her eyes creaked open. "Cancelled. A cancelled client. That's it. You're not fired. It's just a cancellation. What's wrong with you? How would they even know?" Oh, okay. That's not terrible. What's the good news?" Oh, hang on. You're the only person here on TikTok? I mean, TikTok tends to be quieter, so that's maybe. The good news is that the client after that canceled as well, and he was the one who requested the milkmaid scrubs. The beetle woman beamed, and Violet sagged in relief, letting out a shaky laugh. It didn't matter that the good little cows were usually excellent tippers. Not having to deal with one was a boon for which she was grateful. "Oh, I'm just crushed. Guess that means a long lunch then. Should I go clock out?" "Yes, please. Go enjoy yourself. You've earned it." Gellius started her shifts at La Vie Rouge in the mid-afternoons, draining the day's menu donors early enough that their blood had time to congeal and be turned into dramatic culinary offerings, decorative aspics and foams artfully plated on spotless white dinnerware. She'd pored over the restaurant's website and menu, marveling over the fanciness and ingenuity of the dishes, despite each only consisting of a single ingredient, desperately wanting to try it and not brave enough to go on her own. The gift of a free afternoon was not one she'd likely get again anytime soon, and if she texted Gellius now, they might at least have time to meet for coffee. When her phone buzzed in response a moment later, she smiled in satisfaction. Perfect, I'm just up the street at the bank. I'll get us a table. The time to get coffee with her friend, get a bit of fresh air, and she'd still come back to the farm to see him for her final slot of the afternoon. It was, Violet thought, waving to the cheerful goblin at reception, a perfect day. She'd not yet visited the Black Sheep Beanery when it wasn't crowded with bodies, and was beginning to suspect the coffee house was packed with customers from the moment it opened at sunrise till the point they needed to physically evict the stragglers in the evenings. It had become a game for her, listening to the conversations of the different species that crowded together as a community within the confines of the small shop, and eavesdropping on their orders, learning which menu items were geared to particular clients. You know, I'm pretty sure that her Minotaur said that he likes to go to the coffee shop in the afternoons, so mayhaps they may run into him. Let's find out. A medium chlorophyll chiller, a kid-sized malted moss sweet steam, and Finny, what kind of lolly do you want? A tiefling behind the counter sighed as the small amphibious child pressed his webbed hands to the glass to ogle at confections within the case, leaving behind twin smudges. Violet grinned as the child announced his selection, his mother groaning, correcting him that one of the elaborate desserts hadn't been an option. She wondered what sort of child a human and a minotaur would have together. For no particular reason, I'm sure. Trying to imagine a baby with messy hair and velvety soft ears and a slender swishing tail. Okay, literally, what is even wrong with you? Your ovaries need to get a fucking grip. You don't want kids for at least a decade, if ever. She was forced to concede that the voice in her head was right, as she watched the child smear his small blue tongue over the glass in front of the cake he wanted, as though he might be able to taste it through the case, and the cashier sighed heavily once more. A decade, at least. There was a tantruming toddler somewhere near the door behind her, as well as what sounded like a cluster of adolescents off to the side of the line, giggling and squealing noisily as she reflected that teens were teens, regardless of species. Tell them it doesn't matter what their suppliers are saying. Their suppliers are lying. Are we really supposed to believe there's not a single axle available to ship on the whole eastern seaboard? They need to figure it out to make the client happy. End of story. That's it. Check in when your plane lands, all right? Her stomach flip-flopped at the familiar edge, the deep, demanding tone. Fucking called it. See, look at what you've gone and done. Started thinking about babies that you don't actually want to have, and now your ovaries are imagining they hear him everywhere. Her phone buzzed them. Then, a text from Gellius just grabbed a table near the windows. What can we get for you today? The horned cashier was addressing her. She realized, only just noticing that the little frog-like boy and his mother had finally moved on. The honeycomb latte, please. Medium. Violet had no doubt that there were other delicious... I'm trying to resist reading ahead with my eyes. That's why I keep getting messed up. That there were other delicious offerings on the menu, but she was a creature of habit, and the decadent honey-drenched latte was too good not to order. And a name for the order? She could feel the heat from the patron line behind her as she gave the cashier her name, suddenly stepping forward, close enough that if she were to step backward, she'd be charting over their toes, a discomforting closeness. The tiefling nodded, opening her mouth to speak when her eyes raised, her attention caught by something over Violet's head, her lips quirking up in half-smile before nodding. A large red-eye cream, no sugar, whatever the floofy dessert drink is she's ordering, and maybe one of the caramel pecan twists. She stiffened when the unseen too-close patron spoke, realizing her ovaries hadn't been imagining things. His deep, resonant voice, just as decisive and firm as it was when it rang across the milking room floor. Fucking knew it. Violet felt her insides turn to jelly at the sound of it, the sound of him, her knees joining suit a moment later when a huge, warm hand landed on the center of her back, gently moving her aside to take her place before the register, swiping his card and completing the transaction for her coffee before she had the wherewithal to do anything more than gape up at them. Oh, maybe one of the twists. The familiar you-faced woman laughed from her place behind the counter, shaking her head as she placed a gooey-looking pastry in a small paper bag, passing it to the big minotaur with the messy hair, the light overhead catching on the gold ring that spanned across his wide pink nose. You're going to turn into one of those twists. He huffed a familiar, delicious sound that went to the place between her thighs she dreamed of him licking, a fantasy that spurred suppositions over how rough his tongue was, if it would be velvety smooth or textured and coarse, if he'd press it into her and lick her clit as she came against its unknown texture, flooding his mouth with her own honey. In this particular daydream, the taste of her would drive him crazy. His thick clock would already be drooling precum in anticipation, and he would flip her before the tremors of her orgasm would even be over, unable to control his ardor for another minute. She's having a full-on fantasy in the middle of this line with him right behind her. His girth as he pumped into her with those slow, solid thrusts, his heavy balls slapping into her still trembling clit, making her come again around his cock. Violet was certain she was about to swoon, the lights overhead suddenly too bright and the voices of other patrons too loud, her thoughts too obscene for the polite company of the little coffee shop. Fancy meeting you here. His voice was a rumble of thunder caught in the mountains, deep and sonorous warning of a coming storm, and as her eyes darted around wildly, taking in his perfectly tailored dress pants, ending in a neat tuck above his jutting hocks, his polished ebony hooves with no scuff in sight, and far larger than she'd anticipated, Violet wanted to be caught in his downpour, wanted to be drenched by him. I suppose this means you can't say minotaurs aren't buying you drinks when you're out and about. I fucking called it. No, I suppose I can't, she murmured, face heating. She felt the weight of his eyes moving over her, slowly and deliberately, completely unlike her own frenzied observance, realizing this was the first time he was seeing her out of the farm's uniform scrubs. She wished he had taken a bit longer of her. Oh, well. RIP to the TikTok. Definitely, it did not like. So, whoops. Oh, well. She'd wish she'd taken a bit longer on her hair that morning, that she'd managed more than just a swipe of mascara before she raced out the door. At least you're wearing decent clothes today and not just leggings and a crop top. She had decided weeks earlier that one of her favorite things about working at the farm was the provided uniform, leaving her free to dress as comfortably as she wanted for her drive. In truth, the clothes that she had on that day were 100% nicer than what she normally wore to work, on account of having avoided laundry for the past 2 weeks. She watched his eyes travel the short distance up her unremarkable frame. Hello, before they finally made their way to hers, and she was unable to read the charged expression in them. He probably doesn't even like humans. Girl, he literally specifically talked about your tiny hands and how he liked when you touched his schlong with your tiny human hands. Girl, you didn't need to do that, you know. He'd not removed his hand until the bag had been passed across the counter, and she still felt the phantom weight of it, heavy and warm on the small of her back, exactly the way it was in all her fantasies. Of course I didn't, he agreed in that low, firm voice, eyes still locked on hers. But I wanted to. Rourke, are you and L'Oreal coming to my Iris Day cookout? The moment was broken when his head raised in response to the sheep woman's voice, and Violet realized with a jolt that the question had been directed at him. Rourke. It's Rourke. Rourke. The initials on his file had been the most intriguing question mark of all. RM, followed by the 8-digit identification number. She had pored over non-human naming websites, looking up the most common Minotaur names of the last several decades, trying to decide if he seemed like a Rugar or a Ravis. Rourke. It was simple and crisp, and it suited him perfectly. Violet couldn't wait until she was alone to say his name aloud and learn its shape, tasting it on her tongue, feeling enormously grateful to the Caprine barista for the windfall of information. Wait, what did she say? Who's L'Oreal? As long as I'm in town, I'll pop in. You know I can't make any promises with my schedule. Hi, Julia. She tsked, shaking her head at his non-committal response. We haven't seen the two of you in months. I'm not taking no for an answer. Well, if I'm traveling, you can put a picture of my head on a popsicle stick and pretend I'm there. I'm not making plans for L'Oreal, so don't try to get me in trouble like that. Oh no. Does he have a woman? No, it's probably like it's probably like a misunderstanding kind of thing. He wouldn't have a woman, right? What would be the female version of a Minotaur? Just Minotaur? Because I feel like Minotaur usually implies a male. Anyway. Violet's warm feelings for the ewe-faced woman shriveled as she continued to good-naturedly carp over Rourke and the mysterious L'Oreal, having missed the last several parties she'd thrown. Of course he wasn't single. Of course there was a girlfriend in the picture, maybe even a wife, she realized with a sinking stomach. Somehow, in all of her daydreams, she'd never imagined him being coupled, even though she should have suspected he would be. Handsome, successful, a voice that sent a shiver up the listener's back, and a cock that would leave his partner sing stars. Expecting that he'd be single to boot was a fanciful bit of wishful thinking on her part. It was foolish and naive to assume that visiting the farm meant he was single, to assume he hadn't been including himself in the description of family men with a mortgage and kids at home, with a fashionable, svelte businesswoman for a wife. It was patently idiotic to assume he'd ever be interested in someone like her, an unremarkable human, no career, drowning in debt, nothing to bring to the table with someone like him. Minotaurette. Yep, that's it. Suddenly, there was nowhere she wanted to be less than standing at his side, listening to him make fun weekend plans with the barista and his apparent wife or girlfriend. Gilius was waiting for her after all. This is what you get for taking your eye off the ball. This job is supposed to get you out of debt and help tide you over till you find something real. She could change her schedule, would pick up a weekend shift and ensure she no longer worked on Fridays, would put him out of mind and forget her silly, one-sided crush. His hooves barely made a sound as he edged around the counter, and she realized for the first time that the dark wood was actually some sort of laminate, spongy enough to absorb the heavy tread of sharp hooves and thundering orcs alike. You'll probably never be coming back here, so what does it matter? The voice in her head was right about that. This place would be forever tainted now. You're not going home early, are you? As ever, his question had a ring of demand, trapping her in his pointed gaze. Violet swallowed down her emotion and squared her shoulders. She had been a fool, but she didn't need to continue acting like one. I had a cancellation, she explained, using her overly sunny customer service voice. A small furrow appeared in his eyes, velvety soft and slightly vexed, and she had to clench the soft leather of her clutch to keep from stretching up on her toes to smooth it away. No more of that. You're done being stupid over him. Chlorophyll chiller for Sleva, honeycomb latte for Violet, and a red eye for Rourke. His big hand reached out, palming her latte before she could turn towards the pickup counter. Violet. The sound of her name uttered in his rich, deep voice was enough to rock her off her tentative foundation of determination. Her name and his voice invoked a field of her namesake flower, rich and lush and purple, more sensuous than she could ever remember it being said, and she forced herself to swallow down her disappointment. Stupid. So stupid. Thanks again for that. You really didn't need to. His hands hadn't fully relinquished control of the steaming cup, even though her small fingers had already curled around the heat guard, and the brush of his skin, so soft and warm, made her quiver. He hummed, a deep vibration of air she felt in her own lungs, unable to force her pinky, the same one that had slipped into his foreskin, caressing its clock head from within, making him groan in pleasure, away from where it pressed against his thick fingers, unsure if the heat she felt came from the hot cup of coffee or from his skin. Like I said, I wanted to. Would you care to? Well, there's someone waiting for me, so I should let you get back to work. The words came out in a tumble, not realizing she'd spoken over him until they were already out, unsure of what he'd been saying. The cup was relinquished fully, surrendered to her waiting hand, although he did not back away. Lunch date? There was an edge to the thunderclap. Ooh, he's jelly! And his eyes seemed to bore into hers, holding her captive in their chocolate depths. What difference does it make to him? She thought, jutting out her chin defiantly. He likes you. You're making assumptions. You're assuming that he has a partner. He very clearly fucking oh, girl. Exactly. Neither of them had moved a muscle, but it suddenly seemed as if a lake of distance separated them, the warmth in his eyes shuddering, pushing her out to stand on a far-off shore. Then I ought not to keep you, he straightened, his posture seeming a fraction tighter than it had only a moment before. Until this afternoon, Violet. She had no idea how she managed to prevent her knees from buckling as she wove through the bodies, feeling the heavy weight of his eyes on her back until she turned the corner, heading to the side wall. Gellius sat with her untouched Earl Grey steaming before her, her mouth slightly open as she gaped. Who was that? What? Don't wet me like a fish. Who was that delicious slab of beef? The realization that her friend had seen her talking to him, to Rourke, made her cheeks heat again. So much for this being a perfect day. Just a client, she grumbled, glaring down at the latte, still feeling the phantom brush of his fingers against her own. No one important. Girl, don't even be fucking lying. Don't even be lying right now. The vampire laughed incredulously, shaking her bleached head. Lovey, come off it. That was not just a client. I was coming out of the loo while you were standing there mooning at each other like it was a private suite. Violet glared at her friend's knowing smirk and laughing eyes. What were you doing in the bathroom? She demanded, attempting to turn the conversation around. Do vampires even need to use the bathroom? No, that's not gonna work. We can discuss the intricacies of vampiristic lifestyle and the maintenance and upkeep of an asymmetrical haircut another time. I want to hear about that big sexy friend of yours. Yeah, girl. Spill the tea. Not her Earl tea, though. He gave me the shivers. Looks like the type that might enjoy taking you over his knee if you've been a naughty girl, if you know what I mean. The image Gellius's words put in her head, one of her, wearing her best interview outfit, the slim-fitting pencil skirt down around her ankles along with her panties, the red outline of his hand stinging her, still jiggling ass cheek as she splayed over his knees, the solid steel shape of his election pressing through his perfectly tailored trousers, made her drop her head to the table with an audible thunk, squeezing her eyes shut and wishing she had just stayed home today. You should call the office and tell Donoxa you're feeling sick. It's only him and 2 other clients you'll be missing, and then tomorrow put in an availability change. He's not anyone, she insisted from the crook of her elbow, still feeling the weight of his hand at her back. Rourke. He's no one important. Methinks the lady doth protest a bit too bloody much, but I suppose we'll let it slide. For now. I can promise you he won't be nobody for long. Yeah. It's more just monster fucker friendly and not really lesbian. Yeah. The thought of leaving the other collection technicians in a lurch had her returning to the farm, despite her heart wanting to hide away to lick its wounds. What wounds? You made assumptions. You're assuming bullshit. You're not wounded, bitch. Sorry. And soon she was finishing off her first earner of the afternoon, listening to his Bluetooth conversation as he dressed, and she scanned in his bottle. Maybe you can talk some sense into him, Janeth. I'm just saying, the second that ring goes in, that's it. It's all over. They can still do the whole ceremony and vows thing, and if it's not a huge fucking mistake, he can get the ring put in for their anniversary. He's your brother. You need to talk to him. It's not too late to back out. The client's voice trailed as he exited the upper portion of the collection room, leaving her alone. She had wondered about the ring he, Rourke, wore on his nose. The accoutrement was sported by many of the minotaurs who visited the farm, and she'd assumed it was for cultural reasons, like the intricate braids worn by orcs, but it had seemed insensitive to question. It's fine. It's going to be fine. He's a client, and you can make small talk with him like a normal client today and put in for an availability change the first thing tomorrow. She half expected him to still be gripping the same coffee cup as she entered the room. The same furrow rested between his eyes, tightening his features, as she pushed her heart back down her throat. You can do this. Long time no see, she called out cheerfully in the same cheery customer voice she'd used earlier. His mouth pressed in a firm, flat line, his eyes tracking her movement around the lower portion of the room. I have a cultural question for you, she said, deliberately turning away to pull a tank from the rack. Make small talk. Don't talk about this afternoon. If it's not disrespectful to ask, what does the ring in the nose signify? I've always wondered, and the client before you was talking on the phone about convincing someone not to do it. Is it a religious thing? He stiffened, the weight of that afternoon and the great gulf of distance still sitting between them. For a weighted moment, he said nothing, his hands unbuckling his belt in slow motion. When he spoke at last, his voice was low and clipped. Historically, it's a symbol of ownership. Being bound to another. The modern usage is almost always to signify being bound to another in marriage. She nodded, her suppositions confirmed. Don't cry. There's nothing to cry over. Maybe you can change your availability on the portal as soon as you get home. The thought that this might be the last time she saw him, the last time she would talk with him and flirt with him, the last time she would hold his heavy clock, the last time she might see that transforming smile that made him seem so much softer, made her throat stick, and she quickly moved beneath the table to shuffle papers on her clipboard. Although he'd not yet smiled at her, hadn't given any indication that he was going to do anything more than glower from the top of the room, and in all likelihood, the last time for all the things she would miss was probably last week. I've been divorced for about 2 years now. Just haven't had the damn thing taken out. At first I wasn't ready, but now I'm afraid it's gonna hurt. The air in her lungs seemed to freeze, the blood in her veins slowing to a halt, leaving her suspended and immobile beneath the bench. Divorced? It took a moment for her brain to force her to breathe once more, culling the brief flare of hope. So he's divorced. So what? She's a girlfriend then. Well, I'm sure getting it removed couldn't possibly be more painful than having it put in the first place, she forced out, in that same high-pitched to a chipper voice. That doesn't change anything. You're both jealous of nothing! But also the possessiveness that each of them have is kind of hot, so. How was your lunch date? His words were a sharp bark, tinged with something else she couldn't immediately define, a question to which he demanded an answer. He'd straddled the bench by then, but had made no move to lean forward, and Violet had the feeling he'd keep her waiting indefinitely until she responded. It was very nice. I haven't been able to do anything in the afternoon like that in months. Thanks again for the coffee.
So it sounds like you've got some fun weekend plans coming up? She didn't know what possessed her to continue the line of questioning, but playing this tense little tit-for-tat game with him. But the question escaped her traitorous mouth, matching his sharp, accusatory tone before she could suck it back in. What happened to meaningless small talk? Senna lives in the same development. She and her brother Xavier, the ram with the dreads, they own the coffee house together. Did you know that? She and her husband love throwing big block parties. It's always a little claustrophobic for my tastes, but I try to pop in when I can. Now she wants us to RSVP, which is asking a bit too much. Who is L'Oreal? There was no way her tone could be construed as anything but antagonistic, and the fire engulfed her the instant she'd spat the question out, mortification burning her alive. She'd only hoped it would put her out of her misery swiftly. Silence seemed to fill the space like a tangible cloud. Violet wondered if she'd be able to back out of the room without earning his notice, but if she crept like a mouse, backing towards the door, she might be able to wrench it open and flee before he could twist on the bench and to catch her exit. L'Oreal is my neighbor.
Thank you.
The words came out in a low growl tinged with frustration, and she was forced to reach out for the table to hold herself up. His neighbor? Not a wife or a girlfriend. The fucking neighbor? She lives next door. She's an elf with a huge orc boyfriend. We used to go to all these block parties together because we were the only singles at the time. Not anymore, obviously. Oh, she whispered, shrinking beneath the table. His neighbor. He was going to ask you to have coffee with him. You could have made out in the parking lot, but instead you pretended to have a date, and she's his fucking neighbor.
That's what I'm saying.
The room blurred, the tears she'd been holding in for the previous several hours unable to be dammed up for another moment. The way he'd darkened when she said she was meeting someone, all the warmth going out of him. Your Capricorn lover will be prone to fits of jealousy and possessiveness. Piquing his jealousy is a good way to remind him to treasure his mate, as long as his feeling of security in the relationship is quickly assuaged. My friend Gallius, that's who I had coffee with today. I met her last month at the coffee shop, and she kidnapped me to keep from talking to one of her clients at work, and we've been friends since. An interminable pause followed her disclosure, with no hint of movement from above.
You love how... This is how I am when I read books. This is why the original idea was me just reading, so that you would just hear my outbursts. Because I thought that would be interesting. But now you get to hear my outbursts and also the book itself, so...
But yes, this is what I'm like when I'm reading. That's who you were meeting? Violet could hear the scowl in his voice, and a quick glance upward showed her the way his hands curled tightly around the side of the bench. Yes, she squeaked. She works at La Vie Rouge. It's a vampire restaurant in the business district? I know of it. She's a vampire? I really want to go there, just to see what it's like. There's nothing like that where I'm from. I grew up in an all-human town. Did I ever tell you that? Anyway, that's who I was meeting today.
She's trying so hard.
The shadow of his horns on the ground beside her shifted as her rambling cut off, as if he were shaking his head. Do vampires even drink coffee? She orders tea, Violet laughed hoarsely, rubbing away the foolish evidence of her tears, listening to the bench creak overhead as he shifted, those huge, polished hooves scraping against the footrest as he settled into place at last. And she doesn't drink it, she just holds it and smells it. Says it helps her remember. Interesting. And you're not afraid of being in a restaurant with all those hungry vampires? He's protective. We love to see it. No, she exclaimed, her laughter buffeted by his big body, filling the hole in the table and sealing out the light. The shift in the conversation was baffling, the levity in both their voices, as if the enormous weight that had rested over the room when she'd entered had been plucked away.
A cat. Salem! Hi, buddy. You want to do interesting reading with us? Yeah. I know. Here, you can chill on my lap for this, because we're just reading.
And she bounced on her toes giddily. He was single. She tried to remind herself that nothing had changed. He was still a client, and she was still just his milking technician. But a weightless euphoria surged through her all the same. I think it's fascinating. Like I said, I'm from a human town originally, so I didn't grow up with other species the way people around here did. I really love it, though. When my lease is up, I'm thinking of maybe trying to find something in the area to eliminate the drive. So, an elf and orc live next door to you? Move in with him. Yeah. Can you settle, Salem, please? Not quite, just the elf. Her boyfriend lives in Bridgeton. He comes to my gym when he stays with her on weekends. And he lifts an absurd amount of weight. I'm waiting for him to pull something in his groin or pop a blood vessel in his eye. It's only a matter of time before it happens. She laughed, imagining the posturing that must go on at a multi-species gym. She should probably offer to spot him. Salem, please. I'm trying to read smut to the people. Come on. You should probably offer to spot him. I'm sure she would appreciate that. His clock swayed, full and fat, thickened with arousal and waiting for her. Ah! Salem, no! he switched pages on me. Buddy, pick a spot, please. And he chuckled as she lubed up her hands. I'll bet he would have already taken... I'll bet he would have already had a ring taken out of his nose too. Orcs are super tough, right? He harumphed at that, and she smiled, wishing she could lean up and place a soft kiss to the shiny pink crescent of that domed helmet, just barely peeking out from its fleshy confines. Girl. Alright. If there wasn't a camera, he'd suck his soul out. I'm not so sure about that. They put rings on their tusks, but that's like piercing a fingernail. There are no nerve endings involved. I grew up on the edge of a human town, sort of in between their town and our settlement. My grandmother was a human, so it never felt like an awkward thing. Not until I was older. No vampire restaurants there either. Do you wanna come down? Come on. The confidence seemed like a precious gift, one that she would add to the shape of him in her head, solidifying him further. Make your Capricorn mate feel valued and appreciated, and he'll make you the center of his world. Rourke let out a ragged breath as she gripped him, stroking him slowly, reverently, lovingly, trying to channel her feelings through the tips of her fingers, and chuckled again, relaxing fully against the bench as he hardened in her hands. So, the ring out and a vampire restaurant. We'll have to see what we can do about that. I'm gonna come, the spotted bull moaned, bellowing as his horns cut through the air. I'm gonna come so hard for you. You're the best breeding bull in the stable, Violet assured the Minotaur above her. I'm gonna milk you dry. The good little cows were, if nothing else, a predictable lot. They bucked and bellowed, stamping and scraping their hooves against the stalks as if they were about to charge, begging to be milked like the cows they were. Of all the things she'd learned about minotaurs in the several months she'd been at the farm, this particular kink was the most eye-opening. What are you doing on top of the printer? She'd begun to wonder, as she moved amongst the different species of employees at the farm and the residents of Cambric Creek, if they all possessed different species-specific sexual proclivities. She recalled a conversation with Gellis in which the vampire had pointed out the obvious human kink Violet had been ignorant of before taking this job. It's interesting, isn't it? The vampire had reflected, inhaling the fragrant steam from her cup. There's a fair bit of you bleeders here in town, but it's all women. You know what that means, right? She'd had no clue, and Gellius had rolled her eyes. You're all just a bit curious, just a little inquisitive. Come to a new place, try food you never heard of, and then you find out that Naga who sold you insurance last week has 2 clocks, and obviously you're curious about that as well. So then you ride one of those clocks just to see what it's like, of course, and then take a turn on another, and then he slips them both in, and there's no human with a one little boring clock who will ever be good enough again after that. Not now that you've been DP'd by a sexy snake man whose name you can't even say. So then you move to a place like this, and it's all very clean and respectable, and no one never lets on how horny they are to try something new. And it's only ever women. That's a fucking lie. There would absolutely be men as well. And they have 2? Gellius had looked incredibly smug as she lounged in her chair. The lizard men too. Big ones, small... Bye, Salem. Big ones, small ones. Some with squishy little spikes. Always fucking with the box. It's always a treat if you're not expecting it. So you're saying every human in town's only here because they want to be dicked down by another species? Boy! Hey! God damn it. Say bye, Salem. Bye! Anyway. Gellius had smiled, showing a hint of glinting fang. I'm just saying, look, you know the one who comes in here every day? The fireman? Violet had bit her lip, flushing as she nodded. The dark-haired man who'd been in front of her in line the very first time she'd come into the Black Sheep did indeed come in nearly every day. At least every day the girls met up, always with that same wide smile and quicksilver sheen in his eye. He was a werewolf, she'd learned, from a prominent wealthy family. He's got a whole lot of brothers, and they're all that scummy. Wait. Oh, yeah. All that scrummy. The one he throws these parties, and I've heard it's like ancient Greece. Just naked women getting taken on hands and knees in the grass everywhere, and the closer they get to the full moon, the wilder it is. Humans come from towns away, all over, all hoping for an invite, because deep down, it's every girl's fantasy to be fucked by the big bad wolf. No. I can't help but feel like there's a point you're trying to make. Has that big bull of yours rutted you yet? The elves at the next table turned disdainfully at the strangled noise that had come from her mouth, head dropping to hide in the crook of her arm as Gellius laughed. I'm gonna start keeping an ear to the ground in my complex. Let you know if something opens up. Housing market round here is fierce, because Lovey, once he does, you'll not be going back to humans, is all I'm saying. Violet pulled on the bull's big quizzicals, spotted like his hide, as the good little cow moaned. The sucking nozzle of the milking machine finished him off, and the light turned green. It had taken her the better part of 3 months, but she finally understood what Kirime had meant by saying their job wasn't sex work, not from the point of view of the technician, and that a job was a job, regardless of the work one did. It might have been in the human communities, but things were different here, and Gellius was right. Different was good. I'm gonna have the new girl shadow you for the rest of the afternoon, okay? The shift leader called out as soon as Violet entered the employee area, turning into the locker room before she answered. The patterned scrubs were discarded and dropped into the laundry cart, and Violet pulled a fresh set from the rack, solid lavender, before she was able to school her features into a mask of Kirime-like cheerfulness, turning to the shift leader. Sounds good to me. Will she be with me for the rest of the day? She made an effort to keep her voice even and her tone nonchalant as she gathered up her charts, keeping her eyes averted, her lips pursing when her question was answered in the affirmative. She didn't want the shift leader to question why she wouldn't want the brand new employee to be with her all day. Didn't want her taking a closer look at the charts. It was a Tuesday, the most unassuming day of the week, past the Monday blahs and not far enough past the excruciating Wednesday ughs, with several days to endure before Rourke's standing appointment on Friday afternoons. But then Donoxa had handed off her charts that morning, the purple sticker at the bottom of the stack instantly raising her heart rate and igniting her daydreams. She didn't know why he'd be visiting the farm so soon after his last appointment, if it was him at all, and the notion of having someone else there to disrupt their time together, disturbing their conversation, intruding on some false intimacy she created in her head, was most unwelcome. Bitch, it is literally not false. Y'all want to bone each other. Just kiss. Just kiss already. She didn't think it was unreasonable to be upset, learning she was to have a shadow the entire day who would watch as she milked bull after bull, seeing the marked difference in the way she would handle the last client's cock, the way she would savor the time spent stroking him, or worse, she'll be the one doing the milking. Violet remembered her first days of training, the way Rourke himself had been the first client she'd worked on. It was absurd to feel jealous, but her fists balled all the same. You'll get a training bonus to make up for the tip loss, the shift leader went on, confirming her fears. If you could trade off on every few clients, that would be great. Let her observe you, then let her take on the next couple. Don't shy away from feedback, she added, brow furrowing. This one has technically already had 2 weeks of training, so she should know what to do, but I'm not ready to let her out on her own, if you know what I mean. She hadn't, not at that point. But the reasons behind the shift leader's hesitation were made obvious as Violet observed the girl on the second client of the afternoon. She seemed to have no problem setting up the room, although she audited herself against the checklist infrequently. Not an ideal situation, something that can be corrected with a reminder. Her milking technique, however, left much to be desired. Up and down, a tight grip with no variation. She handled the clock belonging to one of the earners with the same energy and excitement that one might undertake a forced exercise, and Violet was uncomfortably reminded of her old university roommate shake weights, and the way she'd mindlessly jiggle one in her hands as she watched soap operas between classes. So, did they tell you during your training that you should be checking the file for every client? You know they have preferences listed sometimes, right? The girl shrugged again, loading the used collection tank and tube onto the conveyor belt where it was whisked away for cleaning. Yeah, I saw it. I was doing it, I thought. Violet frowned. The mindless up and down motion the new girl's hands had adopted didn't come close to being what the client had requested. Didn't even look pleasurable. Maybe she's just bad at hand jobs. Wrong place of employment in that case. Maybe she'll be better on the next one. One client turned into 3, and Violet quickly discovered her optimism was misplaced. So, you're doing a really good job setting up the room, she began several minotaurs later as the girl executed the cleanup protocols. The last 2 sessions had been heavily reliant on the use of the sucking nozzles of the machine to bring the bulls over the edge, and she knew the girl would not last long with her current method. You've got a good handle on the machines and the process, so nice job. Did you by chance watch the training videos? The girl was another human, something that would have thrilled her 3 months earlier, a fact that seemed oddly unimportant now. She'd been spending more and more time exploring Cambric Creek, preferring to undertake as many of her chores there as she could. She'd been giddy the first time she went up and down the aisles at the Food Griffin, finding her own run-of-the-mill grocery items nestled amongst exotic fruit nesters for moth and bat people, Maltese bath products for those of the reptilian persuasion, toasted kelp crisps, unidentifiable breakfast foods, and bags of double crunch cicadas in poppin' jalapeno. There had been another human one evening, slowly making her way through the produce section with a tall mothman, absent-mindedly mmming along to what sounded like a lecture on bees. Her eyes had met Violet's as they passed on opposite sides of a tower of bananas, and her smile had been kind and conspiratorial, an assumption that Violet was like her, a human who'd successfully broken through the barrier of this mixed-species society, so different from the world they were from. Gellius really does have us all figured out. Babe, are you actually going to voice an opinion on what you want, Or is it just talk about potter wasps all night? She had moved too far up the aisle to be able to hear the moss man's exasperated response, but smiled to herself, imagining passing the couple on another occasion, Rourke pushing the cart as she picked out pricey organic fruit, nodding to the other human over the bananas and sharing her conspiratorial smile, an acknowledgement of a club in which they were both members. Being a human felt like less of a handicap now than it had several months ago, and while she was willing to cut this new human employee a generous amount of slack, it wasn't an excuse to not do the job well. She watched as the new girl wrinkled her nose in response to the question. Yeah, sort of. That lady's voice was so annoying, though. I don't understand why it was so long. Violet smiled woodenly, watching as the trainee gathered up the final chart of the day, bearing its purple sticker. Well, I'll be honest, you need to watch them again. Your technique is lazy, and you're not paying attention to their charts. The notes are there for our benefit, you know. Get them in, get them out, and on with their day so we can fit in more clients. You can't rely so much on the unit to do the work, and besides, a lot of the clients don't like for us to use them much. It was good advice, she told herself. Maybe a little harsh, but necessary if the girl wanted to last. Unfortunately, her words were not received as well as she'd hoped. The girl scoffed, wrinkling her nose. Why does it matter? I thought as long as they come, it's fine. If that were true, why would they need us? If we're just going to slip the nozzle on 2 minutes after getting the clients in the chair, they could do away with our position entirely. We had to pass off 2 charts today, and that's fine. You're still in training, I guess, but it's not going to be fine in 2 weeks. You need to check yourself against the list, and I strongly advise watching the training videos again. And I'm going to take the last chart. We're already running behind. The only sound in the echoing hallway as they moved to the last collection room was the swish of her scrubs, the new girl trailing sullenly behind. Violet entered the room first, giving him a smile that she was grateful the other woman did not see. We have a trainee joining us today, she announced cheerfully, hoping her chipper, fake tone conveyed how she felt about the company. His head cocked curiously, his chocolate brown eyes tracking the young woman who slumped petulantly against the wall. Why don't you get us set up? She instructed as Rourke stepped out of his pants. Violet listened to the sound of his heavy tread crossing to the breeding bench, the creak of the frame competing with the sound of the chrome tank being pulled from the rack and hooked into place. Well, I'm doing it. I have an appointment for this weekend. I'm taking the plunge. You're finally going to cut that scruffy hair, she guessed, laughing when he made a noise of outrage, his broad nose wrinkling around the gold ring. His horn sliced through the air as he shook his head in annoyance, and she laughed. What? No, I'm getting the ring removed. She wasn't sure how the contents of her chest managed to melt so completely, leaving behind that gooey marshmallow heat. Congratulations, she murmured, feeling the trainee's eyes on her back. That's a big step. It is, he agreed, but it's overdue, and now there's an incentive to be free and clear, symbolically back on the meat market. I wonder why he would feel that. His rich voice enunciated each word clearly as if he were giving a PowerPoint presentation, selling the benefits of his ring removal, the reverberation of which he felt down to her core as he straddled the stalks, leaning over to peer down at her. She wondered if he could see the way her skin had flushed, if he was able to divine the reason. Is this bitch gonna get her in trouble for flirting with him? I swear to God, if this motherfucker gets her in trouble for flirting with her man, I'm gonna fucking lose it. I thought maybe someone new was requesting me when I saw the sticker this morning, she added after a moment as the other girl went through the motions of the setup checklist. Violet held her breath, listening for his reaction. Piquing his jealousy is a good way to remind your Capricorn lover to treasure his mate. A Tuesday notch on my dance card. A bullish snort was her only answer, his hooves scraping peevishly against the turf. I'm glad it's not, she quickly added, keeping the second half of the website's advice in mind, although I don't know how I got lucky enough to see you twice in just a few days. A mollified grunt, and then he was leaning forward, settling his weight against the bench and filling the hole. She wants him to be filling her hole. She had thought about his clock all afternoon, watching the inefficient way the new girl manhandled client after client. He was thick with arousal, the veins snaking around his girth seeming especially prominent. Every minotaur who visited the farm had the same anatomy, vaguely human-like in shape, thick with mid-shaft swells and bulbous heads, but she would be able to pick his particular endowment out of a lineup with ease. You mentioned wanting to go exploring on weekends. I assumed that meant you're off then. I took a gamble that you'd be here. Does this mean you won't be coming later in the week? His voice dropped, deeper in pitch and lower in volume, stern and pointed, meant only for her ears.
Oh!
Sorry, I read it. Oh, I'll be here. I've been needing to masturbate more often lately. This weekend the urge was especially demanding. I thought coming in for a good training might help take the edge off until Friday.
Oh, girl. Get it, girl.
Her hands were trembling when she raised her oiled gloves to cup his sack full and heavy and hot with need. Coffee and an argument with you on Friday, and then frantically beating off all weekend. Poor baby. The thought of him taking his huge clock in hand, pumping it as he thought of her, wasting his valuable release because he was overcome with horniness. It was a terrible fucking day to have a shadow following her every move. She wondered how he pleasured himself, if he used a firm overhand stroke or a softer touch mimicking the inefficient grip of her small hands, drawing out the process and edging himself until he came with a messy eruption, dragging her nails slightly down his pumped quizzicals. She bounced them against her palms, grinning when he growled, "They definitely feel very full. We'll have to make sure we give you a good, deep milking today. Help tide you over until Friday. And then the ring comes out Saturday." This was their foreplay, she thought, her stomach swooping over the implication of his words. And then you're back on the meat market Saturday. Free and clear. She took a deep breath, glad for the mask that hid her smile, hoping the new girl wouldn't notice the affection with which he gripped his clock, and slowly began to stroke. I'm getting too invested, I keep forgetting to switch the words. Oh boy, okay. You. His voice was accusing. Next chapter. An affronted scowl creased over his broad, handsome face. Violet noticed immediately the absence of the ring in his nose. The unencumbered nostrils flared in indignation, feeling a pang of regret that she'd not been there to see him in the days following its removal. You don't need a one-sided infatuation, remember? The voice in her head was right. It's not one-sided. Get a grip. It is clearly not what he is actively flirting with you. Actively. Even in front of other people. The time away had been good for clearing her head of the cobwebs of senseless lust she'd allowed to spool and stretch, obliterating her good sense and professionalism. Being back under her parents' roof and sleeping in her childhood bed for the preceding 2 weeks, had done wonders for shaking thoughts of the messy-haired minotaur away, reminding her of the bills she needed to pay, the career she needed to actually start someday, and the plan she had for her life. Pining after a client isn't part of the plan, especially one like this. He's got money. Let him take care of you. And then you can fucking jerk him off all day. Girl. Anyway. He's probably been out with a dozen different women since you've been gone, putting himself back on the meat market. bitch is stupid. Glancing over her shoulder, she made a show of looking around, as if he might be referring to someone behind her. Where have you been? I had to practically twist someone's arm off just to find out if you still worked here. Oh, you must have been out with a dozen other bitch! Violet bit her lip, trying to imagine him cajoling information from the new girl, remaining as stiff and silent as all the other clock watchers during the 2 appointments that she'd missed. They probably didn't tell you much. It's against company policy to divulge any information about employees, especially to a client, she added, reinforcing his status for his benefit as much as her own. His scowl deepened, and she very nearly laughed aloud at the deep crease between his narrowed eyes, his wide mouth pulling into an exaggerated frown. He's adorable when he pouts. The thought came to her unbidden, pulling an invisible cord of tension behind her navel, unraveling her resolve like a kitten with a ball of yarn. It didn't matter how many pep talks she'd given herself over the past week. It didn't matter what she told herself about the futility of her crush or the inappropriateness of harboring such feelings for a client. The instant the traitorous thought crossed her mind, all of her willpower went crashing to the ground. He'd been there with her for every minute she'd been away, imagining his arms coming around her when she cried and the warmth of his hide pressed against her at night, and it was foolish to attempt to persuade herself otherwise. Don't give me that. I can't believe you literally left me in the clutches of that amateur. I was chafed after the last time. Chafed! She was unable to hold in her laughter as she hooked the collection tank into the unit, ensuring the bottle rack was full and the hoses secure before turning to let him see her eye roll at his dramatics. It was the first time she'd laughed in what felt like ages, and the fact that he'd been the one to invoke it felt significant. Despite it seeming like the week had already been endless, it was only her second day back to work after being absent for 2 weeks. And although she'd never be able to prove it, Violet was certain that Magda had given her the most challenging rotation since she returned. The very first client the previous day had been one of the most vocal of the good little cows, lowing enthusiastically as she stroked him, and things had quickly deteriorated from there. Oh, milk me. Please milk me. You're gonna milk me dry, the Minotaur had moaned, bucking wildly against the padded stalks above her. She had begun to compare every Minotaur she worked on to Rourke, comparing their endowments and the way they felt in her hands. That bull's clock had been long and pink and thin, like a writhing tentacle. Ew. Her hands had missed the heavy weight that she'd grown to prefer as she struggled to maintain a rhythm, ringing the slippery, snake-like appendage. Why are you describing it like this? In between the constant encouragement they liked to receive. Catching hold of him once he'd begun to buck and thrust left her feeling like a rodeo clown, and Violet was certain she'd been less than gentle in ramming the sucking nozzle down his length, but she was past caring by then. It had set the tone for the rest of her shift as she handled one challenging client after the next, and today had not been much better. It had been a long few weeks. Her great-aunt's death had been unexpected. When her maternal grandmother had died when she was a child, her grandmother's sister had filled the hole left behind for Violet and her mother both. Aunt Gracie had always been more like a grandmother to her, baking cookies on Sundays, there for all her accomplishments. Your ears are shocked. Thank you. There for all her accomplishments, both great and small, the call from her mother had given her time to fly home and to say goodbye, for which she was grateful, staying to help her parents with the unplanned-for arrangements. People who didn't know her well didn't seem to expect that the loss of a great aunt or uncle would affect her much, and it was exasperating and uncomfortable to explain. She didn't know any of her coworkers well enough to let them see her cry, and she knew that she would cry if she needed to explain beyond there was a death in the family. Is he gonna hold you as you break down and cry? Is he gonna give you a hug to comfort you? Adding on the frustration of 2 long, challenging days worth of clients had her on the edge, and all she wanted to do was collapse against the big minotaur before her, bury her face against his broad chest, and never let go. That, she reminded herself with a swallow, was impossible, and she had a job to do. Poor thing. That doesn't sound familiar at all. Poor thing, she laughed, ignoring his question and flashing a grin back at his scowl before ducking beneath the bench. The sight of his clock was like greeting an old friend. And she had to fight the urge to lean forward and press a kiss to the tip. We'll have to be extra gentle. Sorry. Extra gentle on your delicate, chafed bits. The lubricant the farm supplied was far thicker than anything she'd ever illicitly purchased at the small pharmacy near her apartment. Thick and viscous with a pleasing slip and slide. Look, it's fine. Pumping a bit more into her gloved palm than she usually used, she slickened her hands before wrapping them around his thick shaft. Her sigh of contentment echoed from overhead. It was the end of the day, Violet reminded herself, and there was no other client booked for this room. A plentiful, speedy collection was what she strove to achieve each day, but it had been a long 2 weeks, and she was tired. Tired and frustrated, and there was no one working who would think to come to the collection room to see what was taking so long. She'd earned this, and she wasn't inclined to rush. The first client I had today was new. Like, new. He'd never done this before. She tightened her grip slightly as she slid her slickened palms against him, running her thumb up the thick vein that snaked up his shaft until she reached the tip. Reversing direction, she worked his floor skin back, letting her palm press into his shiny, exposed head until he hissed. I take it things didn't go well? She smiled at the roughness in his voice. She intended on enjoying his milking session and wanted him to as well. We're reading Morning Glory Milking Farm. Not the Cogulus manual. Oh, it did not. Not at all. Talking as she stroked him seemed to be a new, previously undiscovered level of intimacy. And she could easily imagine herself having the conversation in bed on a Sunday morning, curled against his side as her hands moved, feeling the hot huff of his breath against her. It was a cozy thought, a warm thought, and it's both horny and also kind of wholesome, which I kind of love, so it's cute. Get together already. Fuck. Hornsome. No, that's what he is, because, you know. She could almost... Wait. She closed her eyes, immersing herself in the daydream fully. She could almost feel the silky, coarse hair that covered him, imagined rubbing her nose against his chest, right above his heartbeat as she moved her hands, could feel the weight of the blankets and the strength in his arms, casually curled around her. She held his clock with both hands now, her thumbs moving in rhythmic circles at the base of his head, pressing into his frenulum. Lazy lovemaking would follow, feeling the cool sheets at her back as he rolled her gently, his heavy weight settling over her in a giant bed, something designed for a larger species, one that wouldn't even fit into her little apartment. He literally had no clue. I had to instruct him to take his pants off, show him how to get into the chair. The young bull had possessed the odd combination of cocky swagger and wide-eyed confusion, and she'd blown out an impatient breath, aggravating that she was being set up to have a repeat of the previous day's annoyance. If he'd had been a bit more humble, she might have gone easier on him, might have given him the practiced, cheerful smile she'd learned from Kirime and the fox-faced woman in the training videos. But he'd had a leering grin when she'd entered the room, his hands on his hips as he surveyed the collection floor. He lost his election. Twice. Rourke huffed, and she was able to see the edge of his horns as he shook his head. The Minotaur from that afternoon had lost his cockiness the second his pants had come off, and he'd stood there expectantly as if she were going to climb the staircase to the upper level and jerk him off right there. And then, he finished with absolutely zero warning. Got some on my scrubs before I was able to get the nozzle on him. Half of what he was supposed to be paid for wound up on the laundry cart. You're not trying to one-up me, are you? He demanded, because I got stuck with stiff-grip Sally for 2 weeks, and I thought she circumcised me at one point. They're both so dramatic. Violet let go of him, hunching as she laughed, shoulders shaking, envisioning the new girl's shake-weight motion. Oh no, she cried, eyes streaming with her mirth. Well, we can't have that. Tell me if this is too much pressure, okay? She slid the tightened ring of her fingers down his fat shaft, relishing the familiar weight and heft in her hands before stretching her fingers and tickling the underside of his sack. He would press into her slowly, letting her adjust to his insane girth. He would seat himself fully with a grunt that would sound very much like the one he'd just given as she cupped his balls, pulling them slowly, giving him a bit of the stretch she knew he liked. He would fill her entirely, stretching her far beyond what she thought capable, but she would be used to the feel of him by then, the heavy weight of him, and when he would begin to move within her, her head would drop back in ecstasy, her hands tightening around his wide shoulders or gripping his broad horns. You're perfect. The domed head of his clock seemed extra appealing that day, the tips of her fingers grazing it gently, teasing his foreskin back and forth, up and down, caressing the inside of the sensitive sheath until he groaned. Circumcising this would have been a crime. I'm too ace for that line of thinking. Bye, Julia. Oh my god. She thought, sliding the loose skin back until his full head popped free, like an especially delicious mushroom sprouting from the earth. Hang on. I'm trying to make sure no one hears me. Like an especially delicious mushroom sprouting from the earth, beckoning her tongue to lick away the pearlescent moisture at its winking slit. She would enjoy tonguing him slowly, licking against his frenulum in a constant movement, the same movement her thumb took then, back and forth, over and over, sucking him into her mouth when he grunted in pleasure. Never eating mushrooms again. She would enjoy tasting him, but that would be later, a different time, she thought, returning to her daydream in progress. She began to twist up his shaft, running her hands, one after another in continuous flow, constant stimulation, above her. Above her, Rourke groaned. His wide hips began to cant lightly against the padded breeding stalks, the same way his hips would thrust against her body, slow and deliberate and deep, always so in control, his rough bovine tongue tasting the salt of her skin as he kissed her neck. Violet was able to hear her own cries of pleasure, the mindless begging. Mindless begging, you say? We do love that. The mindless begging that would fall from her lips, the baritone of his own deep groans and animalistic grunts as he fucked her, pounding into her with the same deliberate, measured force with which he rutted against the breeding bench. His heavy balls would hit her skin with every thrust, the percussive slap of them, and obscene music that would fill the room, fat and full to bursting, as he fucked her into the mattress, chasing his release and making her see stars. She'd missed him so much, and seeing him, talking with him, flirting with him, hearing the sharp bark of his voice and feeling its reverberation down her back, felt like coming home. Aww. Went from incredibly horny to wholesome again. It's going back and forth. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The knowledge that, while she'd been home with her family, mourning their loss, going through old photo albums and helping her mother clean out drawers, wishing she'd called more often and had come home sooner, she'd been thinking of him, but not like this. She had envisioned going back to her room, with the little undersized bed every night and collapsing into his arms, losing herself in his calm control, feeling the heat of his mouth as he kissed away her tears. She hadn't missed this, but had missed his stern voice and deep huffs of laughter, missed their banter and his messy hair and shining chocolate eyes. In her fantasy, they would make breakfast together, feeding each other bites of chocolate croissants or blueberry stuffed muffins, sipping gourmet coffee from the Black Sheep Beanery. They'd go back to bed and snuggle and talk and watch nostalgic movies as the sky outside darkened. But first, he would fuck her until they were both satisfied, filling her with spurt after spurt of his extremely valuable seed. Okay. Alright. His deep groan brought her back to the present, his solid, heavy thrusts against the padded breeding bench an echo of her daydream as she worked on the buzzing nozzle over the head of his cock with no time to spare. He continued to rock against her hands when the green light clicked on, lowing as he throbbed in her hands. And gods, how she'd missed him. She wanted to know everything about him, how he liked his eggs, and what he would feel like pressed to her side at night. Can I help you, Salem? No. You're being a bitch. The roughness of his tongue, how he took care of his horns, if he was close to his family, and if he would turn her over his knee, as Gellius had suggested. Stop! Stop it! Following the pulse of his balls as his thrusts began to weaken, she found and pressed her thumb against the visibly throbbing point behind his sack, massaging into his prostate. Her pussy clenching as he bucked in response. His hooves scraped for purchase against the footrest. And he groaned again, filling the machine with a fresh torrent of sailors as she pressed against his sweet spot, squeezing her thighs together in time to the ropes of white splattering the glass. A click and whir from the collection unit made her jump, and she turned rapidly, just in time to see the second bottle rotating into place. She'd never had reason to use both of the label stickers that came affixed to the files, but there was a first time for everything, she thought ruefully. He said nothing as she cleaned him off, giving the customary squeeze with which she always ended things, and remained quiet as she tagged the 2 bottles, the second barely filled to the quarter-line. Turning back to the breeding bench, she was able to see his wide horns still there, laying stock still. I feel like I should have paid for that, he groaned, remaining slumped against the bench as she walked up the small staircase, coming up to his level for the very first time. She realized, freezing on the steps, that from this vantage point, she had a perfect view of his rounded backside and thick thighs, completing the fantasy of what it might be like to have him in her bed. I think you may have killed me. You sure are bossy for a corpse. His messy hair tumbled into his eyes as he raised himself at last, keeping her locked in his gaze as he pushed himself from the bench, grunting as his back cracked when he twisted. His clock swayed between his thighs, soft and spent and still completely enormous, a hypnotic pendulum as he staggered the 6 paces across the room to where his pants rested over the chair back. She watched in fascination as he carefully guided his hooves through each leg, palming his tail and smoothing it through the small slit in the fabric seat, bending to fasten and secure each pant leg over his jutting hocks. Dress shirt tucked in and smoothed, clock tucked away and fly-zipped, He didn't look up until he was buckling his belt, and Violet could almost convince herself that they were in...
Fuck off!
Should we let Salem in? What do you guys think? Do you think he'll be naughty again? Alright, hang on. Alright.
Oh, ow. What? Why are you being a baby?
Okay. Fly zipped. He didn't look up until he was buckling his belt, and Violet could almost convince herself that they were in some cozy little domestic tableau together, dressing for work before he kissed her goodbye. It's strange, he rumbled, adjusting his watch band. The picture of brusque professionalism. You see someone every week, you talk to them, they're part of your routine, your schedule. They become part of your life. You share a certain level of intimacy with them. You miss them when they're gone. You can almost convince yourself you know them because you start to fill in the blanks on your own, but you never really know. A vice had fastened over her heart at his words, so similar to what she herself had been thinking over, and her face felt overwarm, the soft, hazy glow of her daydream giving the past hour... What? I was out there for 30 minutes. Pretty much. He is very dramatic. The soft, hazy glow of her daydream giving the past hour, and her cheeks both a rosy flush, her eyes pricking with tears. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. She's gonna cry, and he's gonna comfort her. It's gonna happen.
Fuck.
You never answered me. Where were you? In an instant, the rosy flush fled, leaving the tears behind. She remembered that he'd not actually been there to comfort her over the last 2 weeks, and that he was right. He only knew her in the context of this place, this job, and that wasn't likely to change. Buddy, can I help you? Oh, now you're being sweet. There was a death in the family. His broad face sobered in a flash, his forehead wrinkling. I'm sorry to hear that. My condolences. Was it someone close? She had already turned, wondering what had possessed her to come up to the top level, robbing herself of the protective barrier of the breeding bench, where she could hide away with her fantasies and not face up to the reality that it was all they were. Tears blurred her vision, and her voice seemed to stick in her throat as she nodded. And she jolted when his giant hand rested on her shoulder, heavy and warm, the way she knew it always would be. His eyes, when she turned, were filled with compassion. I was fucking right. R.I.P. Aunt Gracie was for a good cause. Was for a good cause. Let's get out of here. Come grab a coffee with me. You can tell me about them. He was close enough for her to feel the heat of his body. The pad of his thumb was velvety soft as he cradled the side of her face in his huge hand, catching one of her tears and smoothing it away against her skin. She'd not expected such softness from him, always so sharp and brusque? I don't fucking know. But her head tipped up all the same, willing to meet his mouth if he'd leaned down just a fraction more. She was still able to smell the coffee from her daydream, the little local coffee roaster's beans made in his kitchen as she leaned against him, her face pressed to his strong back. His thunderclap voice, too, had softened, deep and comforting, with no hint of demand, and she nodded, wanting nothing more than to be there with him, be somewhere, anywhere, other than the farm. Go on then, punch out. I'll get us a table. Probably going to need to flip over a booth of teenagers, but it's fine. They'll bounce.
Let's fucking go.
She could feel the weight of his hand on her back as she drifted down the steps, as if the heat of him had burned an imprint on her skin, a glow she was certain the whole world could see as she collected her things and clocked out with her heart in her mouth. This is it. You can do this. Coffee first, then tomorrow you can lock yourself into his house and never ever leave. It was, Violet was certain, a perfect plan.
I'm inclined to agree.
The soft pressure of his thumb was driving her crazy. Around them, the Black Sheep beanery buzzed with its normal hustle and bustle of patrons gossiping in clusters and jockeying for space. She recognized the lab coat-wearing orc at the table across from theirs from her previous visits, laughing with a human woman in scrubs, not unlike those she wore at the farm, and somewhere behind them, a harpy cackled.
That's how love works, coffee then locked in house. Exactly. I don't like coffee, but that's exactly how it works. Yes. You motherfucker. Goodbye again. Yeah, you're being a bitch. Talking back to his mother. So rude.
Rourke had taken her in his hand. Had taken her hand in his when her voice had hitched, telling him of the final days spent with her aunt in the hospital, and folding it in his giant palm in the center of the small table as tears spilled over her lashes.
Bring pasta, locked in house. There we go.
As tears spilled over her lashes, recounting the funeral and the days that had followed. He'd not released her as the conversation shifted, and the gentle, velvet pressure of his thumb circling on the inside of her wrist was driving her to a dizzy distraction. I have a sweet tooth, he'd announced when she first slid into the chair across for him, tucked into a corner of the always busy shop. I wasn't sure what you might like, so help yourself to both. A chocolate croissant dusted with powdered sugar sat on one of the two plates at the center of the table, and on the other Violet recognized one of the caramel pecan twists he'd ordered several weeks earlier. The coffee order just came up a minute ago, so it should still be hot. Her cup was plugged with a steam keeper. A stack of napkins sat between the plates with both a knife and fork. A details-oriented perfectionist. It was enough to make her swoon. Word on the street is you're going to turn into one of these twists. Their situation was ridiculous, Violet considered as he clucked his tongue. She knew how the heft of his heavy sack felt in her hands, knew how much pull he enjoyed on his hot quizzicals before his muscles would tighten, knew the spot on his clock head where he was most sensitive, knew how tight her hands needed to be to make him low deeply. She knew what his orgasm felt like, the pulse of his blood as he came, the way he turned boneless for a moment after. It was so ludicrous to know so many intimate details about the most private parts of him, and to still have known so little about him. Time to change all that.
Get it, bitch. Get it.
You said your grandmother was a human? She was from town and my grandfather grew up on the settlement. It's pertinent to keep in mind that this is in the backwoods of the backwater middle of nowhere. They had over 300 acres of farmland. My parents built their house on one end of it, and my cousins lived in the other end. I would read books about kids that would just go out and play without having to muck out stalls and collect in the chicken coops, and I assumed it was make-believe. The image of him as a child with tiny nubs for horns and soft lamb-like ears made her stomach somersault as she laughed. I didn't realize minotaurs lived in groups like that, like orcs. She tried to envision the patrons of the farm all going back to the same little neighborhood, and thought that much testosterone in one place was a recipe for disaster. They normally don't. This was a very isolated community. Human towns all over. Goddess no- That's me, hi. Goddess knows why other species stayed put in areas like that, but if they did, they usually stuck together. His voice held its usual matter-of-factness, but he hesitated for a moment before continuing. It's not always safe to be surrounded by humans that way. That's why you see things like servitor herds and wolf packs. He'd been married for nearly 5 years, had started his own company, owned a home in Cambridge Creek. He was a proper adult, a thought that left her shifting against the seat of her chair. She drove a car that had belonged to her aunt, the same generic orange juice that was still in her refrigerator, and she had to save her tip money to even be able to come to this pricey little gourmet roaster. He is so out of your league. This night is going to end with him shaking your hand so he can enjoy the weekly hand job with a clear conscience. But he'd still not released her hand, still stroked the inside of her wrist like she were a kitten in his palm, and the unexpected tenderness from him, always so stern, so in control, had French braided her lungs together, leaving her heart to thump pitifully from within the tangle. I'm an only child, so was my mom, so I didn't grow up with a lot of family around. My mom wants me to move back home, to be closer, and I know it's because she's lonely. She doesn't really want me to give up doing something I love, but I don't have a career. This is just a job, so I feel guilty. I'm a millennial. Being anxious and guilty is my birthright, I guess, right? But I do love it here. Her mother, unsurprisingly, had conspired with Miss Tinsley, and she found herself sitting across from Carson Tinsley in a small cafe a week after the funeral. The conversation with her junior high crush had been stilted and strange, completely unlike the time spent with the big minotaur. I love learning about the different cultures and the food. It's amazing that so many different species can come together here. It makes me want to explore everything. It's not always roses and sunshine, he'd cautioned with another one of those deep chuckles, a vibrating rumble she wanted to feel against her skin. Some people don't wear pants. Now, I'm willing to admit that I've lived around humans my whole life, and I understand the way majority culture tends to bleed into everything. But covering your ass in public should be the basic entry point for society, in my opinion. So there's that. But it's a nice place. It can be trying having neighbors celebrating random holidays that involve screaming at the moon on a Tuesday, but for the most part, everyone tries to get along. The sky outside was a wash of pink and gold, the sun a brilliant orange orb slowly sinking to crimson. More than an hour had passed, she realized, yet there had been no awkward pauses or silences, no strained laughter or stilted conversation. Look, I don't know how inappropriate this is or not, but I'm a bit past the point of caring. She jumped at the sudden bark of his deep voice, and he paused, releasing her hand to drag a big hand over his face. I meant to ask you out after I got the ring out. That was the whole point in doing it. I didn't like not having the answers I require, and you were just a very intriguing question mark. I missed you, when you were gone. Her heart folded in on itself. The notion that he had been thinking of her the same way she thought of him, trying to fill in the blanks in his head. I missed you too. Well, I'm free and clear now, and I'd like to get to know you better. A bit of that authoritative thunderclap had returned, and she straightened in her seat, pressing her thighs together at the hint of demand as he continued. I don't want to make things awkward. I don't want to jeopardize anything for you at work. If you want me to pause my appointments for the time being, I will. She shook her head, the ability to speak suddenly deserting her, and the corners of his wide mouth lifted slightly. I'd like to get to know you, outside of the farm, and I hope my feelings aren't one-sided.
They're not.
A flash of white teeth as she continued to flounder mutely, her head bobbing in a nod before shaking again, unsure which sentiment with which she was agreeing. But I don't think they are. Would you like to have dinner with me this weekend, Violet? The sound of her name in his deep voice turned her into a puddle. She had no doubt that if she said no, he'd never mention it again, that she'd likely never see him again at all. She might have gone on pining forever, building castles of dreams in the sky that she would never act on, but she had always been a sucker for authority. She had been certain that he could ask anything of her in that commanding voice, and that she'd be helpless to say yes. Just as she was certain his sheets would be cool against her back and his weight a comforting heaviness at her side. Rourke. I'd love that. Remember, we have, I think, 4 chapters left. 5? We're on 13. I think it ends at 17. So we could be finishing today. We're like past halfway there. All right, let's continue. Remember, just get up before dessert and take your knickers off in the loo. When you come back to the table, give your old bully boy a present. He'll barely be able to wait until the check comes, guaranteed. Violet blew a hard breath out her nose, squinting in the bright overhead light. Don't you think you should focus on what you're doing? I won't have to worry about taking my underwear off if I'm in the emergency room because you waxed off half my labia. All right. The vampire rolled her eyes, taking up the tongue depressor of wax once more. Violet wasn't sure how she'd let Gellius talk her into this, and half suspected that she'd fallen prey to a vampire glamour. No, you didn't. You're letting her do it because you're a horny idiot. The voice in her head, she had to admit, was right. At least this time. Gellius had asked if she would make sure to be freshly waxed for the big night, and she'd responded with a typical deer-in-the-headlights look of panic, for even though she was certain it wouldn't actually matter, she'd never been waxed in her life, and now that the idea had been put out into the universe, she desperately wanted to be. That sort of pricey salon service was definitely not in her budget, even as a splurge, and so Gellius had volunteered, insisting that she'd had salon experience over her vast, long, vampiric life. It wasn't until she was laying on the kitchen table, naked from the waist down with her knee pressed to her ear, that she remembered Gellius had been turned in the 1980s, and was around the same age as Violet's mother. Just hold bloody still, I'm almost finished. She closed her eyes and held her breath as the waxing paper was pressed to her skin, trying to focus on the exact scenario Gellius described, the one that had caused her to be in such a position. She wanted to be stretched by his big bull clock, wanted him to fuck her into next season with those measured, pounding thrusts. But lately, the notion of him bathing her sex with his hot tongue was all she could think of, and her judgment had abandoned her. Tonight. Something's gonna happen tonight. Get it, girl. She had lost count of the dinner dates and midday lunches, the romantic excursions through the quaint little town, and the gallery visits in the city. He'd wanted to get to know her, for her to get to know him, for them to know each other outside of that milking facility, and the heightened sexuality that had permeated their interactions for the previous several months. And she had appreciated his circumspection more than she could articulate. But if the night didn't end with her screaming his name as she came around his clock, Violet was certain she was going to perish from terminally unmet sexpectations. Their first date had been a cozy little trattoria around the corner from her apartment in the city, and he'd been a perfect gentleman. Bridgeton boasted a multi-species population like most large cities, although humans were the majority. She had begun to pay closer attention after his comments about majority culture as she went about her days, noticing goblins and trolls who were nearly invisible in the backdrop of the city's hustle and bustle. She discovered that her little corner bodega carried a small selection of items similar to those she'd seen at the Food Griffin. Kelp-flavored crisps and oddly colored drinks, all stuffed on the lowest shelf at the back of the store. Violet had watched open-mouthed one evening as a petite goblin with wide hips and a sleeve of colorful tattoos, clutching the hand of a small child, entered the store while she was leaning into the ice cream case, moving with purpose to the back aisle. She had stepped back with her strawberry crunch cone, watching surreptitiously as the goblin woman bent, releasing hold of her child and practically needing to kneel to load off her shopping basket with items from the bottom shelf. She let the woman go ahead of her in line as the little boy grew fidgety, and the whole episode had left her discomfited. She tried to imagine being forced to do all her grocery shopping at the overpriced mini-mart without having half a dozen other options, and remembered the conversation she'd overheard in the locker room one day as Kirime and one of the other technicians bemoaned the skyrocketing property market in Cambric Creek. Let me refill my water. Fucking Christ. Because why not? No wonder other species want to move there. He'd met her at the restaurant that Saturday night, standing sentinel on the sidewalk as she scurried across the street, blushing that he'd beaten her there when she lived right around the corner. Of course Mr. Always in Control is punctual. Why are you surprised? She asked about where he'd lived in the city, realizing from his description of the neighborhood that it wasn't terribly far from her own apartment, explaining why he'd been immediately familiar with her suggestion. My ex-wife kept the townhouse, he went on, eyes dropping to the wine glass before him, and my business is in Cambric Creek, so I tend to not have much reason to come into the city these days. Until now, he conceded, flashing her one of those brilliant smiles, transforming him into a softer version of himself for the space of a heartbeat. What happened? She blurted, desperately needing an answer to the question that had been turning over in her mind since that first night she'd met him for coffee. She had come home from the coffee shop that night nearly floating over the way the evening had ended, immediately beelining to her laptop to stalk him online. She wasn't especially proud of that she had developed a knack for digging up dirt on people, but over the years she had discovered a talent for rooting out extended family members' social media, long outdated resumes, and forgotten accounts with only the barest hint of information on her target. She knew his birthday and she knew his name. It was more than enough. In the end, she'd found his ex-wife first. Most people's accounts were set to private these days, circumventing online snoops like her, but the glamorous woman with the crimson smile had public-facing everything. Profile after profile, different social platforms that all linked together. Violet paged through the highly curated... I can't fucking speak anymore. I'm sorry. Curated, glossy life of her former spouse, feeling more and more like a drab little mouse with every click. Her mind had supplied her with the image of someone tall and slender, like the tiefling at the coffee shop, clad in expensive business attire, with a stern expression identical to his, well matched in profession. The voluptuous beauty posing beside a green-tiled swimming pool, her long ebony hair wrapped in a turban with oversized ivory sunglasses, hiding her eyes and red-painted lips stretched wide, bore no resemblance to the phantom lover she dreamt up. Human-looking, save for the cow-like tail that swished behind her and the curious dark shadow of her back, which wasn't turned towards the camera in every shot. Well, he doesn't dislike human anatomy, at least you know that much. Girl, shut the fuck up. As she toggled back and forth between social platforms, scrolling through the endless feed of selfies and staged photos, Violet noticed the complete absence of real life. No family outings, no milestones or pets, no hint of the man with whom this smiling woman had once shared her life. The oldest photo in the feed was dated 3 years prior, and in those first few dozen, the other woman's makeup was a bit more subdued, her eyelashes not yet lengthened with extensions, her lips stained a dark berry red. He said he's been divorced for 2 years. She had recognized the mark of someone reinventing herself and understood the compulsion well. It would have been easy to do had she found that dream job she'd been expecting right out of school, filling her social feeds with artsy black and white photos of Bridgeton and her life in the big city, the overpriced burnt coffee from the upstreet balancing on the edge, overlooking the high rises across the water. It would have been easy to hide her humble beginnings and human family, just as this woman had completely hidden away any hint of whom she might have been when she'd been his wife. Her stomach tightened and flipped, unliking the idea of him being the life that had been worth hiding. Yeah, get defensive over your man. Let's fucking go. There were no photos of him to speak of, and no social media accounts that she could find under his name, which didn't actually surprise her a bit. Too brisque, too professional for that. The closest revelation she stumbled upon was a comment on one of the oldest pictures on the other one's feed. A clueless, inappropriate comment from someone who appeared to be a relative, damning evidence that he had existed at all. "I'm so sorry to hear about you and Rourke." She'd straightened in her seat at the discovery, quickly clicking on the profile of the commenter. A dozen or so photos of landscape and several children, all girls, all with the same swishing tails behind them. The pictures had no filters and were of an odd, hasty composition, the mark of an older user who was unfamiliar with the photo platform's highly curated vibe. Searching the woman's name, she quickly turned up a profile on Crowd Journal, more widely used with her own parents' demographic. Paydirt. Hundreds of photos going back years. It didn't take her long to find what she was looking for. Vilina's Handfasting. The album only consisted of half a dozen photos, and only one with him. He towered over the bride, looking as neat and severe as he did when he loomed over her every Friday, if not a bit younger. The bride herself was a revelation, clear-eyed and smiling softly, with none of the dramatic makeup or brash confidence on display in her current photos. She'd gazed up at the big minotaur before her, looking like a completely different person. Violet had gone to bed that night wondering what had happened. If this other woman had decided to become someone new before their marriage had ended, if they'd each become someone new, and if the people they'd become after their vows simply hadn't worked together. Violet found that she couldn't think badly of the woman in the photos, for she herself seemed to be completely different from the person she'd been only 6 months earlier, before she'd known about minotaur milking farms and vampire restaurants, when she'd been ignorant to the way her neighbors of different species lived and had been blind to her human privilege. She'd not be able to go back, that was certain, no matter how much her mother and Carson Tinsley from up the street might have wished it. So she could not fault this other woman for reinventing her life in a way that made her happy, and she clearly seemed happy in the multitude of photos. His mouth had pressed and his head had cocked consideringly. We had very different priorities by the end. It wasn't any one big thing. It's not like someone was cheating or anything like that. It was one of those things. She wanted to travel. I was just starting my business. All of her friends were single. I was already working. We drifted apart, and pretty soon we were strangers who happened to live together. I was far too boring for her in any case. Well, I have great news for you, because I'm the most boring person I know. The rich sound of his laughter had spilled over her like a thick flood of dark chocolate, warmer and more vibrant than the quiet huffs she'd heard at the farm, melting her insides in a way that was becoming deliciously familiar as he caught her pinky with his index finger on the edge of the table. "You don't bore me. Not in the slightest." "Stop it." If she'd thought at the time that the 2 bottles of red wine they'd shared would have lubricated the path back to her bed, she might have been disappointed. He'd walked her to the door of her building, and the invitation to come up had never had a chance to escape her mouth, swallowed up by his lips as they'd been. His mouth was wider than those belonging to any of her previous partners. They smooched, wide enough to engulf hers completely. But his lips were soft and his wide tongue hot and rough, and he'd kissed her until she was clinging to him and dizzy. I've wanted to do that for a very long time. Ooh, girl. Deep and dark, his voice had rumbled against her, exactly the way she'd suspected it might, as she'd fisted the front of his shirt in an attempt to stay upright. I've enjoyed spending time with you, Violet. I hope we can do it again soon. Soon had been 4 days later, when she'd met him for a pre-dinner drink at a crowded happy hour pub in Cambric Creek's bustling downtown, before walking hand in hand. Aw, you're holding hands. Oh my god. To one of the many farm-to-table restaurants the town boasted. She'd been keenly aware of their size difference. When he'd lifted her like a doll as she struggled to climb onto a bar stool designed for a much larger species. His thickly muscled arms had scooped her up in a blink, a huge hand in the center of her back until she balanced upon the seat sufficiently. What's that drink with the soda and syrup you make for kids, with the cherries? The server, a fleet-footed satyr, had cocked their eyebrow, making the piercings there bounce. A lullaby? That's the one. See that table of elves at the edge of the bar there? I want to send one to that blonde in the blue dress. No alcohol. And if you can add one of those little paper umbrellas, all the better. The satyr had narrowed their eyes dubiously, looking from Violet to the big minotaur before turning to put the order in with a shrug. Did you just buy another woman a drink right in front of me? I did, but just wait. She'll be stomping over here in a minute. This way we can make introductions without needing to get up. He leaned down then, easily covering the distance between them at the small table, and she'd barely had time to suck in a breath before he was kissing her, stealing the air from her lungs and doing nothing to ensure the continued dryness of her panties. Thank you for meeting me tonight. I know Wednesdays aren't exactly the most romantic date night, but the idea of not seeing you until next week didn't sit well. The baritone vibration of his voice went directly between her thighs, her head practically lolling as the edge of his muzzle grazed the shell of her ear. I can't believe you have to cancel for Friday. The news that she'd not be seeing him at the farm that week had been a crushing blow, and she'd been mourning the opportunity to milk him, the first time she'd have done so since he'd come to meet her in the city. Taking his clock in her hands and listening to his tightly controlled gasps and grunts, now that she knew exactly where her head came up on his chest, now that knew he preferred to start his meal with dessert. Alright. Now that she knew how searingly hot his mouth was on hers, was the most erotic thing she could imagine, and she'd been looking forward to his weekly appointments since he'd left her on the doorstep the previous Saturday. You didn't think of taking this trip while stiff grip Sally was covering for me? She hadn't had the chance to fully appreciate his full-throated laugh, as a woman had appeared at his elbow, petite and full-figured, with long tapered ears, her sapphire eyes narrowed as she jabbed Rourke's shoulder. You know, joke's on you because I actually like these. As if to prove her point, the elf tipped back the fruit-adorned drink as she carried, smacking her lips defiantly. Please tell me you didn't tell Zena I'd absolutely be at her party. Because that sounds like something I'd do after all. Do you mean to tell me Mr. Perfect isn't overjoyed for the opportunity to ooze and schmooze with the whole neighborhood? The elf cocked her head, considering, and Violet used the opportunity to gawk. Her dark blue eyes were wide-set and fringed in pale lashes, with the spray of freckles over her tiny button nose. She was lovely, and Violet was forced to wonder if she looked as drab and boring in comparison as she felt. Actually, he would, you're right. Her lips curled into a self-satisfied smile as Rourke snorted, and then the elf's eyes turned, taking Violet in for the first time. Hi, I'm Lurelel. Are you planning on making introductions, Rourke? She was introduced to the infamous neighbor, the full apples of the other woman's cheeks rosy pink as she smiled, blue eyes flashing as she looked from human to minotaur with an approving hum. Violet, I'll warn you now, he's very bossy, and if you go to get ice cream, he will harass you for a taste of your cone. That's okay. I'm pretty sure she very much wants him to be bossy. Just a hunch. It doesn't matter if he sampled it at the shop. He's greedy. But he's a very good neighbor, so I'd appreciate it if you didn't convince him to move away. Oh, we just got a new patio set. You'll both have to come over for drinks and dinner. Cash likes to pretend that he single-handedly wrestled down a mastodon every time he turns on the grill. It'll be great. She'd left the table soon after, extracting a promise from work that they'd come over some evening soon, before disappearing through the press of bodies to return to her friends. Violet liked her enormously. Dinner had just been up the block on the vibrant little town's main street, and when the bill arrived, she'd attempted to pull a handful of carefully folded bills from her wristlet before he'd stopped her. No, that's absolutely not happening. Put that away. And he spoils you, girl? Get it. She'd not thought about it until the day after their first dinner together, realizing in mortification that she ought to have attempted to pay her half. What kind of feminist are you? She couldn't remember the last time she'd been out and hadn't paid for her half, including her coffee date with Carson Tinsley, which accounted for how infrequently she went anywhere. She had come prepared that night, several weeks of her tips smoothed and tucked into her wristlet. But I didn't even offer to pay the other half the other night, and I should have. Violet. If the commanding rumble of his voice hadn't silenced her, the heat of his hand dropping to her knee would have. I don't want you to feel that you don't have any agency here. I might be the one giving all the orders, but you hold all the cards. Your comfort is the only thing that counts right now, and if I overstep, I want you to know you can tell me so. But that's not happening. Don't think I'm unaware we're at different points in our careers. You can say no, you can say you don't want to see me again, you can tell me to stop coming to the farm when you're working. It's dinner, not down payment on your time. But I'm in a position to comfortably spoil someone. So when you're with me, I'm spoiling you. End of story. Ooh, I love that for you. Love that. Love to see it. She was a good feminist, she'd told herself, and she definitely couldn't be bought. But if he had suggested at that moment that he would have appreciated a blowjob, she would have fallen face first onto his clock with an open mouth without a shred of hesitation. Like the previous weekend, the night had ended with a kiss that had nearly turned her inside out. The hot pressure and texture of his tongue reminded her of her suppositions over what it would feel like licking her sex. His giant hand wrapped around her hip, drifting lower as he nibbled on her neck until he palmed her ass, kneading over her cheeks. She could feel the heat of his election through his neatly tailored trousers, pressing herself tighter, eager for whatever could happen next. He leaves on a business trip tomorrow, and he's missing his milking appointment. He's not going to want to leave town without letting you suck him off, at the very least. Hang on, let me show you guys, I want to show you guys the cover so that you can have a better visual. Nope. Morning Glory Milking Farm. Hang on, let me. So there's your visual of both of them. Okay. She'd been about to ask if they were going back to his place when he released her, locking his hands around her elbows when she swayed. I'll miss seeing you this week, but I'll call once I'm back in town. Hiccupy. I'm glad the visual helped. She'd somehow managed to make it back to her apartment, texting Gilius in aggravation. She appreciated that he was acting like a gentleman and that they were taking a bit of time to get to know one another. She did. She was certain if they hadn't, that she'd be doubting his interest in her as anything other than a casual human dalliance. Her rational mind reminded her of that regularly. But the other half of her, the base, animalistic side that thought of nothing but his clock and how it would feel erupting inside her, was ready to climb out of her skin. Her friend's suggestion to her ire had been typical. Send him nudes. She'd not had the courage to go that far, but had instead sent a casual photo of herself wearing a thigh-skimming slip of a nightgown curled atop her blankets. It had taken nearly 2 hours to set up and artfully arrange herself on the bed in a way that didn't look like a jumble of knobby knees and chubby thighs, taking and discarding photo after photo before she'd sent it off with a message thanking him for dinner and that she'd miss him while he was gone, opening an incognito tab on her phone to load up some Minotaur porn. Scrolling until she found a bull with similar coloring to him and set to work rubbing circles against her aching button as the human on screen was taken from behind. Wow. So you started your business out of spite. He'd blown out through his wide pink nostrils hard enough that it lifted the pecan brown hair that fell in his face. That's a tremendous oversimplification. She dissolved into giggles at his wrinkled nose and offended tone, leaning forward in a swoop as she laughed, the solid grip of his hand the only thing that tethered her to the earth, until he swung her around to crash into his side, his broad body absorbing her laughter. You did too. You took your ball and went home and started your own game. A better game, he grumbled in response, earning another peal of laughter from her. More respectable, absolutely more profitable. They were walking along the trail of the town's titular creek several days after he'd returned from his trip, and she'd been asking for the full story of how he'd left his job in the city. He'd started with a company that distributed farm machinery right out of school, working his way up to Senior VP of Sales, a title that had made her swallow hard. And you're just happy to have a 4-digit bank balance. She'd learned he'd fled his small-town community as soon as he was able, earning a university scholarship and never looking back. As a result, he wasn't particularly close with the younger siblings he'd left behind. He didn't need to tell her it was something he felt guilty over. She was an expert in guilt and being anxious over other people's feelings, and recognized it when she saw it. They stopped caring about the people they were selling to and started cutting corners, going back on their guarantees. At that point, the money didn't even matter. It could have been my grandfather being taken advantage of, or my brother, or one of the neighbors. I don't ever want to directly work in agriculture again, but they're good people, hardworking people. I like knowing I'm doing my part to help them. He shrugged, big hooves clicking on the paved path as they walked. So I left, waited out my no-compete clause, rented office space. The people who run this town, you only need to get on their good side once. I helped out one of the local farms with a warranty issue on my own time, and that old centaur took away my good deed back to the Farmers Alliance. By the time I was ready to set up shop, I had all of their business. Violet gazed up, her heart positively overflowing as he grinned. He was sharp and stoic and unsmiling most of the time, but when he did smile, it was worth every moment without its light. She's getting all romantic. He was solid where she was anxious, strong when she would have caved, but she thought that her own positivity filled in the gaps of his harder edges. Her easier smiles and chipper attitudes complemented his steeliness, written in the stars. Tell me about the people who run the town, she begged, swinging their joined hands in a most undignified way. Oh, the Applethorpes, right? He'd taken her to the Applethorpe Manor already, one of Cambric Creek's oldest and grandest residences, which had been donated to the town as a museum, and she'd pored over every room, every arch and decorative door transom, every board of the intricate two-toned herringbone hardwood floor and the meticulously restored wallpaper. It was everything she loved, and it thrilled her that he was indulging her interests, and she'd been eager to learn more of the town's apparent and checkered history. Okay, hear me out. I have a seam spect. He's gonna somehow help her get started in her career, right? And also, I seem spect, he's gonna start getting jealous, thinking about her essentially getting off other bulls at her current work. So it's like both. It's like, I don't want to imagine you with other, dudes that aren't me, and I'm going to help you get into the career path that you actually want to be in. We'll see if I'm right. The Applethorpes, he agreed. What's left of them, anyway? The Hemmings, obviously, they're at the top of the food chain, and the Irondricks. Shifters and Wares, that's who settled this town originally. I'd love to get you into the Slade Manor. We'll have to figure out how to finagle an invite to the Halloween seance. Maybe Lorelei knows someone. The water widened at that point, spilling over a short cliff of rocks and spectacular falls view right in the center of town, and she'd squealed over how picturesque and lovely everything was. Cambry Creek was, she was slightly distressed to learn, just as expensive as the city, if not more. All of the accommodative architecture and restaurants and scenery came at a cost. One the residents clearly didn't mind paying, and she felt a twinge of guilt over every expensive meal and outing he planned for them, every little gift bag of lace-wrapped artisanal soap and local honey and hand-beaded neck bracelets she oohed over in shops that she went home with. But he was resolute. Spending time with her was the treat, and the cost of it was meaningless. Stop it, that's so cute. If only she knew what to do next. Violet felt stuck in place, a preposterous feeling, considering that she saw him regularly and learned more about what made him tick with each successive week. She adored spending time with him, was ridiculously impressed with his tenacity and ambition, but was turned to goo by his surprising softness with her. But he'd paused his visits to the farm, despite her insistence that she didn't want him to do so. And after half-dozen dates and outings, all she had to show for her time, other than a heart that would surely be broken if he were to change his mind, was a pile of dripping panties and a charging cord that had earned a permanent place plugged in beside her bed. She'd been forced to wonder, as she took the much girthier vibrator she'd purchased weeks earlier off said charger, when she'd come home that night, alone, again, if his balls were achingly full for all the time they'd spent not having sex. There we are, Gilius announced cheerfully after ripping up the last of the wax-smeared papers. Oh yeah, that was the thing she was originally doing. Before we went into several detours. That looks spot on. They really should have let me be more than a shampoo girl, bloody wankers at that place. He'll be able to get his muzzle nice and wet now. You're welcome, Levy. I expect a bouquet of roses this week, once you've had your kitty licked like a bowl of cream. From both of you. Oh, he can afford the really nice ones, too. The long-stemmed jobbies. What the fuck is a jobby? He was coming to the city again the following night, a Thursday, and she was determined there was no way she was letting him deposit her at the building's doorstep without coming upstairs and taking off his pants. His shirt, too. You've never seen him without his shirt on. He might have 6 nipples. It wouldn't matter if he did, she thought resolutely. More to love. Well, at least you're accepting. She needed to figure out what to do next, how to move things along, for she had the... Sorry. I think it's supposed to say nagging. The nagging suspicion that every time she tilted her chin up expectantly, waiting to be ravished, Rourke was, in fact, waiting for her. She needed to stop waffling, stop waiting for things to happen on their own, stop letting the uptight little voice in her head convince her that there was no way he'd be interested in a relationship with someone of her species, of her financial situation, with her at all. After all the shit that you just described in the past chapter and a half, you're still thinking that? You dumb bitch. Why? Stop it. Maybe Gellius was right. Maybe she should take off her panties. Maybe you just shouldn't wear them. Maybe it's time to take this bull by the horns. Teaching, she watched his fork bob back and forth, dancing in the air as he... Chapter 14, we're getting close, I think. Dancing in the air as he considered the merits of his own question before making its way at last to his mouth, his long eyelashes fluttering closed as he savored the rich chocolate and caramel. Her mother would have had a conniption to see them eating dessert, tuxedo cheesecake, drizzled in caramel, and tiramisu as the starter course, but Violet had discovered over the weeks that his admission of having a sweet tooth was quite serious, and that she'd need to acclimate to dessert coming before anything else. I make more at Morning Glory, she admitted. She had applied for substitute teacher's license shortly after graduation, thinking it would be a good way to supplement her job at the urban planning office, but it paid a pittance, and she'd quickly remembered just why she'd pursued art history and not art education, as her mother had wanted. I'm also really terrible with kids, so not the best fit. He made a strangled noise of revulsion, his face screwing up in disgust before stealing a forkful of her tiramisu. Lurelle's warning had proved prescient, and her dessert choice was never safe from his darting hands. They'd need to pay a fortune to make that job worth it. Grubby little hands, never listening. I don't blame you. No kids for you then? They'd seen each other barely a dozen times, and any conversation about anything more than a month or two in the future was comically wishful thinking on her part, so it made little sense for her stomach to flip-flop and wait for his answer. Why are you even asking him? You don't even know if you want kids. Now, I didn't say that, he corrected, raising his fork in defense. I have no doubt in my heart that I'd love my own child with everything in me. Other people's children, though, they're just terrible. Agreed. The room they'd been seated in was nearly empty, so there were no other patrons around to give her disapproving looks as she burst out laughing, sliding closer to him on the banquette, seeking his warmth. Suggesting this restaurant had been by design. She knew they had a fabulous dessert cart that he would love, and there was no traditional seating. Couples gathered on huge velvet poufs and lounge on sets and sit together closely on the long banquettes. She was absolutely not planning on initiating anything improper while they were seated in the sparsely populated dining room. Why not? Why not? Just, put your hand on his leg and just like inconspicuously drag it up a little bit. Drive him fucking nuts. Come on. She only wanted to be nearer to his warmth and pressed to his side, Violet told herself. If his strong arm were to come around her, so be it. If his thick fingers might stroke her thighs, she'd live. If they somehow made their way under her skirt, discovering her lack of underwear, she was prepared to deal with the consequences. Have you ever considered gallery work or something in an architecture office? Finding her a job she would love was his new pet project. Fucking called it. Networking with his contacts and putting the word out amongst friends, she told herself it was only because he was the type that probably enjoyed a fixer-upper, which she was, but it still liquefied her insides to contemplate. I need this bitch to stop degrading herself when he has made it very fucking clear he's very interested in you and who you are as a person. with the fucking pity. For no reason. No reason. He's giving you no reason to be thinking that. That doesn't seem like someone who's only interested in a short-term thing, right? The architecture firms want a more specialized degree, and the gallery jobs are all taken by people who do not plan on retiring until after they're dead. He wrinkled his nose adorably, nodding his agreement with her sentiment, and she edged closer on the velvet banquette until she was able to feel the heat of his thickly muscled thigh. It happened midway through dinner. She had pressed close enough to be flush against him, and his arm had dropped around her at last. Violet was certain he was able to feel her heart thumping, could probably smell her arousal over the half-eaten plates of food before them. Her eyes slipped closed, breathing in the warm, woodsy smell of him, as his giant hand rubbed the side of her hip, swirling the glass of dark red wine he held in the other. This is it. This is it. Violet felt the moment when he realized his fingers weren't moving over any additional fabric beneath the short skirt of her dress, that nothing at all impeded the smooth glide of his fingertips against her hip. No silk or satin or cotton, not even the teensy strap of a thong. She's gonna have a fucking wet spot on her dress, though. She felt him stiffen slightly against her, his hand pausing ever so slightly in its movement before stilling. False alarm, you'd better buy a backup vibrator now, so when you burn out the first one sometime next week, you won't be left with no... Her treacherous inner voice cut off on a gasp, the air in her lungs forced out in a squeak when his velvety touch moved to the inside of her thigh, tracing softly up her skin until he met the resistance of where her thighs met, sealing him out. He stopped moving, but hadn't pulled away. You hold all the cards. Your comfort is the only thing that counts right now. Her chest was heaving, her breath leaving her in pants. He told her explicitly how things were going to work, and she'd been too obstinate to listen. She held all the cards. He'd not continue if she didn't want him to. Her thighs parted. Violet, do you remember what I told you about what you could expect when you're with me? His voice was stern, that of a principal questioning a naughty student, a priest before a sinner, and she gulped. You said my comfort was all that matters, that I hold all the cards. His finger had begun to move back and forth like a clock pendulum, the tip of it just barely grazing her cleft. Exactly. And what else? Each stroke against her outer lips moved a little easier, a little smoother, aided by her slick against her newly waxed skin. Gellius is gonna get the biggest bouquet of roses they sell. The velvety soft digit pressed slightly, breaching her folds and still moving like a pendulum, only now his fingertip pressed into her clit on every pass, a jolt of lightning each time he did so. Her hands fisted on the material of his sleeve, her breath coming out in needy gasps. Cheers. Sorry, I just read ahead a little bit. Sorry. You said you were gonna spoil me. Exactly. Her mouth dropped open and her head lolled against his arm when the same finger pressed, dipping into her hot folds completely, coating itself in the wetness it found there. When it was joined by one of its brothers, stroking and squeezing, pulling and circling against her button, she whimpered, and his answering chuckle was so dark and deep she nearly came right then. Did you think that meant I wasn't gonna spoil this pussy? His fingers had curled, trapping her button between his knuckles, stimulating its hidden sighs as they locomotored back and forth, pulling back its hood and making her see stars. You just need to tell me what you want, sweetheart. You're in charge. Violet didn't feel in charge. She felt as though her spine had suddenly misplaced several vertebrae as she slumped against him, her legs opening a little wider, as though that would somehow help her achieve the friction she craved, the need to come suddenly obliterating everything else. Her clit felt like a live wire, and she was desperate for him to plug her in and make her spark. She didn't see how she was meant to be in charge when he was the one playing her body like a musical instrument, laughing in that dark chocolate laugh with his CEO voice. They're still in the restaurant, by the way. Besides, doesn't he know you like him being bossy? You're gonna need to tell me what you want, Violet. What does this... Ooh? Oh god, how do I PG-ify that word? Am I allowed to say it? I don't even know. I'll just whisper it. What does this needy little cunt want from me? Gruff and commanding, just above her temple, turning her to jelly. Please, she whimpered, too aware of the other couple across the dining room and the server slowly making their way around the restaurant, too aware of the way he was rubbing her clit from the top, from the sides, anywhere but where she needed. You need to use your words, sweetheart. Please what? The outline of his clock stood out in relief in his bespoke gray pants, fat and full and desperate to come out from the looks of it. She wanted to be filled by his clock, to have him stretch her beyond her limits and fuck her the way he'd fucked her in her dreams 100 times already. She wanted to feel the way 24 ounces would gush out of her, but that would have to wait. Right now she couldn't do anything. Look, it's fine. Would never be able to leave this restaurant and see the sun again if she didn't come immediately. He was smiling, she realized. Smiling that smile, the one that she loved, and the sparkle in his eye was completely evil. That sounds familiar. He was a bit of a bastard, but she probably wouldn't have been so hot for him in the first place if he wasn't. Please make me come. But don't get us arrested, she added hurriedly, glancing guiltily around the room. The press of his digits had settled into a rhythm by then, cupping her entire mound in his palm, just beneath the jacquard table linings, and she panted when they began rubbing over her clit at last. Is this what you need? His voice was a low croon just above her head, but her eyes had glazed over by then. She was going to come very soon at this rate, orgasming in public, unable to control herself. Who knew what she'd do next in her frenzied state? I'm sorry, officer. I didn't mean to fellate this minotaur in the middle of the dining room, but you see, he's been playing so fucking hard to get that I snapped. I'll take care of this pretty little pussy anytime you want, sweetheart. Anytime she wants to be licked, I'll be here to lick it and make you come. Eating this pussy is going to be my new favorite meal. Anytime she wants to be stuffed with my fat bull cock, I'll be here to fuck you so good you won't be able to remember your own name. I'm going to spoil you rotten, Violet. I'm going to spoil this pussy every way I can. All you need to do is tell me what you need. Just, just gonna let everyone take a breath for no particular reason. Oh my god, that's snapping. That's so crazy. Oh. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Take a deep breath and relax. There you go. Another deep breath in and out. Very good. And up, up, up. Wake up for me. She'd wondered once if he would say filthy things to her in his stern, always in control voice, but she'd never imagined hearing it this way, in a dark croon at her temple. One of his thick fingers pressed into her heat, and her legs shot out, kicking at nothing, and Violet understood why some of the minotaurs at the farm shook as if they'd just been struck by lightning when they came. She wasn't sure what was short-circuiting her brain faster, the way he was rubbing her or the things he was saying, but when his finger withdrew only to re-enter a breath later with a second, she knew she was finished. He fucked into her with a solid, steady pump of his wrist, stroking her inner walls and never letting up the pressure on her clit, and she was nearly embarrassed by how quickly she unspooled under his ministrations, her orgasm building in a tight coil of pressure. When she clenched around him, thighs quivering, he gave a low hum of approval, continuing his movement until her contractions slowed, the pleasurable pulsing of her peak fading away. She watched him through heavy-lidded eyes, withdraw his hands and suck his fingers clean. As calm and collected as he ever was, just as the server reappeared to refill the water glass. We might need to make an appearance at the block party, after all, just to put the word out that you're looking for something. Zenna and her brother know everyone in town. If there's something open that might fit the scope of your degree, they'll know it. His ability to finger fuck her in public and go right back to the conversation about her job prospects without missing a beat was astounding, and she nearly choked on her wine when the server asked if they were enjoying their meal a moment later. "Do you want to come back to my place?" she mumbled against his arm, once the check had been taken and the table cleared. She realized he was too big to force up the stairs, but as long as he went willingly on his own, she might be able to lock him inside. No sense leaving anything to chance. His laughter was a rumble against her as he captured her hands in his, leaning down to reach her mouth. She wasn't quite used to the sensation of kissing a mouth so different from her own, one that didn't slot against hers like a puzzle piece, but his lips were unfailingly soft as they pressed to her, soft and insistent. "Violet, did you really think you were going to come to dinner and tempt me with your bare pussy? Let me have a taste of how needy and delicious she is, and then kiss me on the cheek out on the sidewalk and go on your merry way?" He enunciated every letter, as sharp and forbidding as he'd been on that very first day, barking that he was on his lunch break. Her nipples tightened, and he tissed at her with a shake of his head. "You're making it very hard to be a gentleman, but I think it's time to bring you home." She'd never fully appreciated how enormous he was. In the wide-open milking room where he towered over her on the upper level, there was no accurate scope. When they walked through Cambric Creek or crowded into one of the always busy little bars or restaurants there, they were surrounded by towering orcs and ogres, trolls and mothmen, and small-statured elves and goblins, obliterating her sense of what was normal or not. Here in her apartment, though, he seemed larger than life and completely out of place. "It's all right, it's fine. He's gonna find his place right here, between your legs." "You're making it very hard to be a gentleman," he repeated, standing over where she sat on the edge of the bed, thighs parted. "It's happening! It's happening!" "Is that the only thing that's hard?" Violet gave herself a mental pat on the back for continuing their little game, leaning up and pressing her lips to the thick bulge at the front of his pants, slightly above eye level from where she sat. The solid, steel-colored outline of his His cock twitched, and she mewed in need. It had been weeks since she'd handled him at the farm, a veritable lifetime since she'd felt his heft and stroked his girth and squeezed his meaty balls. And she felt like she might catch fire if she couldn't take him in hand and run her tongue over his winking slit. I hate that. Why do you say that every fucking time? Why is it winking? Wink, wink, wink. Why? Feel him stretch her wide and fill her with his hot release. Is this what you want? The bulge at the front of his tailored dress pants twitched again as her fingertips moved to trace over the shape of him, and her palm prickled, needing to feel his weight and thickness. Yes, she whispered. Yes, what? Fingertips at her cheek, caressing her jaw. Ooh. Yes, this is what I want. His eyes fluttered shut as she outlined the shape of him, knowing the topography of his member like a map she'd studied for ages, finding one of the veins that snaked up his shaft with ease. You relate to the catching fire thing? Alright. My cock. Is that what you want, Violet? Do you enjoy stroking my cock at the farm? Her mouth ran dry, and her legs opened a little wider, vainly seeking friction that wasn't there. Enjoyment didn't even begin to categorize how she felt about having the opportunity to touch him, to stroke him, and to bring him release. The velvety pad of his index finger caught her chin, raising her face to his, and all she could do was nod dumbly. Words, please. The note of command made her sit up a bit straighter. Yes, she managed to whisper. Yes, what? He was definitely a bastard, no question. She glared up and his smile stretched, clearly enjoying himself. Yes, I enjoy stroking your cock. I love stroking your cock. He hummed in approval, a low rumble of thunder against her. What else do you enjoy? He made no move to stop her when she dragged down his zipper, his hands assisting by unbuckling his belt. She loved everything about his milking sessions, the way he grunted when he thrust against the breeding bench with that slow, solid pump of his, giving her a delicious hint of what it would be like to have him buried inside her. She loved the hot throb of his testicles when he came, and the weight of his cock in her hands, the way his muscles tightened as he emptied because of her. The way you throb and the sounds you make. I enjoy milking you dry. He'd robbed her of the pleasure of his heft as he held his shaft, directing it towards her mouth. Is it even gonna fit? Girl, you said it was like the size of a soda can. The first bump of his cockhead against her made her moan, dragging over her lips, and she eagerly opened her mouth, sliding her tongue over them, her jaw popping when he pressed his head in. She wanted to slide her tongue into his sensitive foreskin, wanted to suck on his friend limb and make him groan in pleasure, had just tightened her lips around the flared edge of his big mushroom head when he pulled away. Sweetheart, I'm gonna give you this cock so good you'll never be able to remember anyone else's, but that's not gonna happen tonight. She cried out when he tucked himself away, realizing he had the fucking audacity to be serious, whimpering as he did up his fly and rebuckled his belt. The outline of his erection still sat heavily against the fine material of his pants, taunting her, and her fists balled in frustration. I thought I was in charge. I thought I got to call the shots, Mr. Bossy. I know, hell of a tease. His laughter seemed too big for her tiny bedroom, rattling the light fixture and making her breath hitch. You are, sweetheart, and I'm never going to leave you unsatisfied. That's a promise. But I'm not going to do anything that might hurt you, and you're not ready to take my cock. You need to be prepped. He glanced swiftly around the room, nose wrinkling. And I can barely turn around in here. My hooves will tear up your sheets. And you're going to pack a little bag when you come home from work tomorrow and bring it with you on Friday and spend the weekend at my house. I can't promise you'll be walking right on Monday, but we're going to do things the right way and you won't get hurt. She might perish before then. although the cozy little tableau he'd painted bore a striking resemblance to her daydreams. Beneath him in his bed, spending time together, screaming in pleasure, snuggling into his warmth. All that was missing was the coffee. On your knees, sweetheart. You don't think I'm gonna put you to bed without a smile on your face, do you? I already told you. I'm gonna spoil your pussy rotten. It was surreal, being on her hand and knees on the bed, facing the wall, away from the room. She could hear Rourke, could feel the cooler air when he pulled her dress up her back and over her head, breathed out a ragged breath when he cupped her breasts, his breath a hot exhalation on her skin as he rolled her stiffened nipples and slowly I hope Twitch doesn't have a problem with it. I really hope that we're good, because it's very funny to do this on stream and just seeing you guys fucking lose it. And slowly caressed his way down her body, but he stayed behind her. She instantly thought of the Minotaur porn she'd watched on several occasions by then, the human in the video keeping her eyes closed as her mouth hung open and her head lolled as she was fucked from behind by the huge bull with his coloring. Rourke's hand came up to meet her center, rubbing wide circles against her lips, finding her soppet. Violet, he groaned. You're gonna be the death of me. Just as she had at the restaurant, she fell apart under his ministrations embarrassingly fast. He'd brought a knee up to the bed as he fucked her with 2 fingers, that same solid thump. And when he added a third, her breath stuttered. He was right, she realized. She would need to work up to the girth of his cock. His ears were just as velvety soft as she'd imagined when she raised her arms to encircle his neck, the bullish snorts of hot air against her skin seeming to set her ablaze as his hand worked against her. So beautiful, she cried out when he pushed her back to her hands and knees, the thump of his own body going to the floor, shaking her shelves, and the first licks of his tongue made her spine quiver. His tongue was hot and wide, rougher than a human's, pushing into her and fucking her from behind. A delicious sensation she thought would be hard to top, but when it lapped at her clit, her mind went blank, leaving nothing behind but golden sparks shooting behind her eyelids. I want you to come on my tongue, he ordered in a CEO voice, just as she'd suspected from the very beginning. She was helpless to obey. You're always gonna come first, sweetheart. Always against my mouth. Understand? She keened as he suckled her button, feeling the vibrations of her orgasm start in her legs, shaking their way up her thighs until she was spasming, his grip on her hips the only thing keeping her from collapsing into a boneless puddle. She came against his tongue in a wave of convulsions, nearly sobbing when its roughness moved to her opening, pushing inside and drinking her nectar. He continued to lap at her as the throbbing within her slowed, licking her pussy like a man who hadn't eaten in a month, and when his tongue continued its journey against the curve of her skin, never slowing in its vigor as he laved her previously untouched pucker in a mix of his own saliva and her slick, she nearly arched off the bed. Gilius is gonna get every rose in town. When he let her drop to the mattress, Violet considered that she might not actually survive the weekend. She'd never had her pussy rubbed this pleasurably, had never been fingered so efficiently before. She'd never, ever had her clit licked in a way that nearly made her orgasm immediately, and her ass might never be the same after the tonguing he'd given it. Once he'd prepped her and stretched her when she'd taken his cock at last, she would never be able to come home. She'd never be able to go back to humans, another thing her vampire friend was right about, and she'd never be able to mend her heart if he let it shatter. Not once she had learned he was as solid and warm in reality as he had been in her dreams. The wide expanse of his nose huffed against her skin, his lips kissing softly up her back, tracing her spine until the blanket was drawn over her. I'll talk to you tomorrow, sweetheart. She was barely able to nod as he kissed the top of her head. Aww. Unable to raise herself from the pillow as she listened to the scrape of his hooves on her floors, the clack of him moving across her tiny kitchen, and the click of her door, signifying he was gone. She liked this new pet name, and she hoped it stuck around. She hoped he stuck around. She needed to get up and turn out the light, needed to set the chain and deadbolt in her door, needed to not be feeling the Pandora's box of emotions that were suddenly pressing her to the bed. She couldn't quite account for the tears that were soaking her pillow, and as an inexplicable sob brewed at the back of her throat, the result of this emotional tidal wave, Violet tried to remember to just keep breathing. No coffee tonight, he announced as she entered the collection room, smiling at the way his voice seemed to bounce against the tiles. We're getting piñata juggernauts, limited time only. Everyone likes ice cream, you can't say no. The only camera in the collection room was above the milking machine, and the scope of the fisheye lens only captured the machine and the cooler, where the valuable collections were stored. The privacy and anonymity of the clients were one of the farm's top priorities, thus there was no eye in the sky in the top level of the room, leaving her free to climb the short staircase and pull down her mask, stretch up to her toes, and kiss the pink expanse between his exposed nostrils. There was no room for argument or debate. He'd made up his mind, and that was final. Violet even though she knew that she'd be giving in to his whims. He'd already let her know that he would be hangry and terrible company if they didn't eat something before their last-minute dinner reservation, and had been grousing non-stop that it had taken nearly a month to secure, and the best time slot offered was at 1 a.m. If they're strolling around getting coffee all day, why can't they have normal reservation times? He demanded the day before, when his name finally came up in La Vie Rouge reservation queue. She'd been going to his house from work, where she'd wait for him to get home and evidently eat a week's worth of sugar by the way of a limited time ice cream treat. She couldn't wait. Okay, first of all, that's very bossy of you. Plus, that thing's got to be 5,000 calories. She'd not anticipated seeing him before then, hadn't expected to see him at the farm at all, but when she'd been handed her files for the day, a purple sticker peeked up from the bottom, sending her heart into a climbing expedition up her throat all afternoon. Her schedule had been a solid wall of earners, the easiest day she could have asked for. Wait, her first client had ground out, teeth clenching, and as the nozzle finished him off, "Don't pull it yet, I've got more." Sure enough, after minutes of leg shaking and teeth gnashing, several more spurts of sailors entered the bottle, bringing it just over the fill line. The bull was maybe a decade older than Rourke, sable with ivory markings, with horns filed to smooth rounded ends, and a braided copper ring in his nose. It was an impressive amount, Violet thought as she labeled the bottle, all things considered. "Our youngest is starting school in the fall," the Minotaur said with a shaky laugh, pushing himself off the bench on unsteady legs. "We thought the local university would have been less expensive than moving away, but—" He trailed off with a shake of his head, and Violet nodded sympathetically. "Nothing here is inexpensive," she agreed, earning a snort and another nod as the bull hitched up his jeans. "I understand why, and it's such a nice place you wouldn't want to see anything change, but still, that's a lot, you know." She added as the Minotaur headed for the door, "Oysters and spinach. Add them to your diet if you're not allergic. The zinc and folate help with production. If you're trying to bank that first semester." She trailed off with a blush. "Oysters," he repeated seriously, head bobbing, either not noticing her reddened ears or not caring. "I'll definitely be doing that. Thanks for the tip." The rest of the day passed in a similar fashion, and she found herself paying closer attention to her client than she ever did before. Every Minotaur who came in with a ring through his nose left her wondering if he had a new baby at home, a family vacation to save for, a down payment on a house. The bulls without rings may have been students, may have been looking to splurge on a gaming system or pay hospital bills or start building a retirement fund. She'd long ago accepted that Kirime was right. This wasn't sex work, not for the employees, but she realized that it likely wasn't for the bulls who visited the farm either, at least not for many of them. Humans have commodified us. This wasn't any different than selling plasma for bar money. She passed the other human in the hall just then, who would forever and always be stiff-gripped Sally in her head, the girl plodding along in a pair of alpine milkmaid scrubs. Well, it's still sexual for some of them. She'd practically bounced into the collection room once his file finally rested in her hands, overjoyed that she'd be able to hold him and stroke him again, but he'd yet to release his hold on her as his face screwed up into a familiar pout. Then we'll share one, Rourke insisted, dropping his giant hands to her hips, preventing her from pulling away. You can pick the flavor. There are chocolate stars inside and rainbow confetti, so frankly I don't even understand why this is a conversation. And I'm an eldest child, so just in case you were keeping score, being bossy is my birthright. His always messy hair tumbled over his forehead, and when she leaned forward against him, reaching up to brush it back when she felt it. He was there for his weekly appointment, there to be milked, and he'd always followed the courtesies of the farm. It was preposterous for the heavy bulge at the front of his pants to shock her, but she gasped all the same when he pulled her flush against him, a slow, closed-mouthed grin spreading across his face. She had held his cock in her hands, had stroked and pumped it, knew its weight and sensitivities, but feeling it pressed to her, even through several layers of clothing, when she'd not yet felt it pressed to her, was torturous. She clawed at his broad chest for purchase, whimpering when his hips shifted, moving the hard bulge against her. You know, he murmured, hands continuing to press her to him. I was originally going to cancel today. I've got a hot date tonight. I figured I should probably stay home and get ready. Then I thought it might be smart to keep my normal appointment. Take the edge off before tonight. But now I think I'd rather keep the edge. Save it all for her. Oh? Her voice came out on a squeak, and his smile twitched. And what made you change your mind? Well, you know, I like this girl. A lot. We have a great connection. We have fun together. I can envision her in my life in 5 years, 10 years. I know that all probably seems a bit premature, moving a little fast, but this isn't my first rodeo, and I've been stupid in relationships before. Now I know what I want, and she checks all my boxes, and I think I do for her as well. And tonight is supposed to be the big night. We've been taking things slow, and I'm a gentleman after all. Let her milk you. Let her do it. Her throat closed and her finger clenched the material of his crisp dress shirt, a shade of lavender that was so pale it was nearly silver. If he'd rushed her into bed as quickly as she would have liked, she would always wonder if that's all their relationship was to him, a sexual release from a source he already knew could satisfy him. He liked her personal touch, and she'd always been secure that that was all she was to him. It was backward thinking and simply outdated, but her mother and aunt had talked about no one buying the cow when the milk is free for years, and she had obviously absorbed a bit of it. Instead, he'd brought her into his life and had given her the opportunity to call the shots. He's been making such an effort, literally from day one. He'd picked most of their date locales. He'd taken a step away from her work to prevent muddying the waters. They'd been hiking and gone for walks in the park. She had seen grand old buildings and beautiful art, and tried new food and met his neighbor and obvious friend. He'd acknowledged their different social standings and had given her every opportunity to change her mind, like a gentleman. Her cheeks colored when she realized how little sex actually had to do with it. Like a perfect gentleman, she agreed, leaning into him. Nothing was said for a long moment, and he cradled the side of her face in his palm. What had become a familiar, tender gesture. The pressure of his velvet thumb against her cheek was a whisper, and she thought he was right. He checked all her boxes. His smile lit the room, and she swayed. I'm gonna leave. Save this all for later. Back and forth, a movement so slow she might have thought she was imagining it. He pressed his erection against her. A promise, she thought, of things to come. It wasn't all about sex. but the sex was absolutely gonna be a perk. It's a good thing we're going back to his place then. You'd wind up gumming the washing machine in the building from the mess on the sheets. Mrs. Muhlstein will try to do her laundry after you and get everything covered in Minotaur milk. As a matter of fact, he continued, interrupting himself with a slight groan when she twisted her hips to grind into the bulge in his pants. Not even sure we're gonna make it to get ice cream. We might just need to jump right to the post-dessert activities. That'll just make the main course more satisfying, she suggested with a laugh, pushing herself off his chest until he released her hips. As much as she wanted to drop to her knees and service him with her mouth right there, it wouldn't do to get caught, not if she still wanted to be employed tomorrow, and she was forced to agree with him. Keeping an edge had been thrilling, if not a teensy-weensy bit frustrating. Boo! Boo. Let her milk you. I guess I should get going if I'm not giving a collection today. I might end up surprising my date early. I hope she comes prepared. She thought he might have been joking. His massive truck was sitting in the driveway when she pulled up to the address he'd given her, a cute little Cape Cod style on a tree-lined street, and she half expected him to be waiting at the door, ready to lead her on to the night's adventures. Instead, she needed to knock, letting herself in when his deep voice bellowed that it was unlocked from somewhere deep in the house. Her earlier explorations of the neighborhood in Cambric Creek had not gone amiss, for she saw immediately that the entire house seemed designed for someone his size. Rourke's slate blue house was nestled in between two of identical build, the accommodative architecture. Look, it would have been such a satisfying tease for her to get to do that to him, you know? To just really fucking rev him up. But no, I'm gonna fucking save it. Architecture that made this multi-species community so in demand. The doorways were wide and tall, the depth between the counters and the cupboards great enough that his horns would be safe from collision. Everything bigger, taller, designed for someone of stature and bulk. She just stepped through the kitchen, eyeing the green tartan blanket on the back of the sofa when he appeared. The small white towel, slung low across his hips, was all that he wore. Wore was a bit of an overstatement, she realized, for the jut of his erection pushed forward the front of the towel, showing the curve of his heavy balls just beneath the hem. Dragging her eyes up his taut abdomen, over his pebbled nipples and broad shoulders, taking in the way his short hide thickened around his neck, full and plush, she wanted nothing more than to wake up beside him, with her face pressed to his throat. Oh. Her eyes continued their hungry climb, landing at last on his aggrieved scowl. You're wearing entirely too many clothes. I thought we were going for ice cream, she exclaimed with a laugh, earning a terse headshake in return. He crossing his massive arms over his chest, and she held her breath, but the towel stayed where it was. We discussed this. After dessert activities first. Then dessert. Then we'll need to take a nap since we're going to dinner in the middle of the fucking night. The dress she'd be wearing to the restaurant that night belonged to Gellius, a black dress more sophisticated than anything else she owned, with a deep, plunging center cut down to the small of her back and the middle of her chest respectively, making an ordinary bra an impossibility, but she should have known that borrowing anything from Gellius would automatically mean that ordinary would not be part of the equation. Oh, he's gonna fucking lose it for that. The goal is to show some skin, not cover up like a bloody abyss. Of course you're not gonna wear a bra. Do you want him to be able to reach across the table and pinch your nipple or not? The thought of Rourke nonchalantly freeing her breasts at the dinner table to play with her nipples in front of the other patrons was a preposterous one, but she would have been a liar if she'd claimed it hadn't made her wet. The dress was safely secured in her back seat, and she'd chosen a simple sleeveless shift for the start of the evening's adventures, appropriate for getting ice cream and strolling through town or whatever else she thought he might have up his sleeve. This needs to go, immediately. She had barely enough time to kick off her shoes before he was drawing the zipper down her back, letting it puddle around her ankles, his scowl growing deeper as he eyed her mesh bra and panties. I can't believe you wore underwear. Now you want to keep your panties on? Violet, did you by chance think I was talking about a different date?
He's so sassy.
He continued to glower as she laughed, but made no move to stop her when she reached out and tugged on the corner of the towel, letting it fall to the floor, freeing his cock with a bounce, full and fat and completely delicious, and hers for the taking. If there's someone else coming, she's gonna need to get in line. I've waited long enough. You guys have to get in line, apparently. That's what she said. His eyes closed with a groan when she wrapped her hand around his stiff shaft, stroking it as she'd done countless times before, knowing exactly how he liked to be touched. Is this what you want, sweetheart? Is this cock what you want? She continued to stroke him as he walked them backwards down the hallway, turning her to drop onto her back against the biggest bed she'd ever seen. She was struck at that moment, gazing up at him, how completely non-human he really was. It was an easy thing to overlook at the farm. Minotaurs came and went in a constant stream all day long. She never saw more of them than the view afforded by the milking room's lower level from their hips up. Clad in t-shirts and uniforms and business attire, it was easy to trick herself that under their clothes they would look just like any other human, if not bulkier. Seeing him like this, standing over her, broad-chested and thick with muscle, every inch of him covered in his silky coarse hide, his bulging thighs giving way to his hocks and hooves, his thin tail a sinuous whip behind them, felt positively primal. Definitely no going back to humans after this. I feel like you could definitely, tease her with the tail. Up and down the back or, the chest or something. This is the only cock I want. I feel like I'm an Athenian sacrifice. His responding chuckle was a rumble against her breasts as he covered her. You know what happened to those sacrifices, right? What did they teach you in your human schools? That the Minotaur ate all of the tributes? That's true, but not in the way you think. I'm gonna give you this cock, sweetheart, but you know the rules. First, you need to come on my tongue, or nothing else happens. Solid rule. His tumble of messy hair tickled her stomach as he kissed his way down her body, pausing to press his wide nose to the front of her panties. The heat of his mouth closed over the gusset, the press of his tongue against the material, wide and hot, so hot, scraped over her clit as she arched. Being sucked through the mesh of her underwear shouldn't have been as hot as it was, Violet thought. But when he abruptly changed direction, moving back up her body to her mouth, she yelped in dismay, grabbing onto his shoulders as his huge horns loomed above her. Violet, I just wanted to say, I really like you. Sudden shift. The sharp tone was gone, his commanding CEO voice replaced with a ring of sincerity. I'm glad we took some time to get to know each other. I know this wasn't exactly a traditional way to meet, and I wanted to make sure you knew I was interested in you, not just your perfect, tiny hands. What did I tell you, bitch? What did I fucking say? Her indignant laugh cut off on a gasp as his mouth met hers, teeth pulling her lip. She liked him too, liked him enough that she could see herself in a relationship with him, could more than imagine those lazy Sunday afternoons, the coffee and snuggling and soft lovemaking. He was more than a client at the clinic, more than an initials and an ID number on a white-filled bottle. The heat of his tongue was like a trail of fire, laving at each of her nipples in turn, catching them in his blunt teeth, scraping and snuffling, breathing his molten heat across her stomach and over her hips. When his wide muzzle nosed against her thighs, her legs fell open once more, gladly allowing him to press against her, his thick tongue pressing into her folds. She wasn't sure if the time would come when she wouldn't completely fall apart as he ate her, completely engulfing her entire sex with his huge mouth. His tongue was so thick and wide that it moved across every inch of her, from clit to slit. And it was the all-encompassing pressure and heat of his impeccable sense of rhythm that pushed her over the edge. The shape of his mouth meant he didn't so much suck on her clit as he did slurp on it, an act that involved the roughness of his tongue and the pressure of suction, but wetter and somehow so much better. Better than anything she'd ever experienced before, and likely never would again. Fucking clit to slit. I fucking can't. The pressure that began mounting behind her navel began to involve her legs, a twitching convulsion that involved her entire nervous system as he slurped at her clit, groaning encouragement that sent her to the stars. Her hands locked around his horns as she shook, pussy throbbing against the roughness of his tongue, and the bastard had the nerve to laugh, the vibrations of his chuckle against her making her contort all over again. When he coated his thick fingers in a lube retrieved from the bedside table, the smell immediately made her sit up. Did you get that from the farm? Actually, I did. It came in my third reward tier. Your what? Wait, never mind. Tell me later. Use a little bit more. It feels thick, but it loosens up the more you work it. She dropped back on the mattress again, breathing deeply. She could do this. You just need to relax. Don't tighten anything up. His first finger stroked into her slowly, pressing into her walls and curling in all the right places. It was a slow, delicious torture. His second finger added a fullness to the pleasure, and he continued to press and stretch, scissoring them open against her resistance, and Violet knew that she was meant to be focused on opening up for him, but it felt so ridiculously good that she moaned, earning a reproachful huff. The third was a much tighter fit, and she was reminded that his hands were considerably larger than those belonging to his human counterparts. I'm gonna go slow, but I want you to tell me if it's too much. A deep rumble that brokered no argument. Her eyes fluttered as his hand continued to move. Watching him drizzle the viscous lubricant over his cock was more erotic than it had the right to be, and then he was dragging the fist-sized head over her clit, and her composure broke. Please, she whimpered. Please, please, please. I need your cock so bad. Her begging broke on a gasp as the thick flare of his head caught at her lips when he pressed into her agonizingly slow. In the morning she might look back with rose-colored glasses and might remember nothing but pleasure, but at that moment she felt the burn, his fat cock stretching her further than she'd ever been stretched, pressing into her steadily. You don't need to beg for it, Violet. It's yours, anytime you want it. But begging is so much fun. Having her beg for it is more fun. I'm gonna spoil your pussy with Sorry. I'm gonna spoil your pussy with this big bull cock every day if that's what you want. Sorry. Him calling it big bull cock is what caught me. The backward drag of him pulling out made her throat stick, and then he was pushing back in, further than he'd gone before, and Violet was positive she felt it pressing into her spine. Oh yeah, absolutely great time to join. Welcome. Yes, give it to me, she wheezed, burying her fingers into the thicker hide around his shoulders as he began to pump, slow and deep, deeper than she'd ever been fucked, and it was so fucking good. You've been so good, she babbled, so sweet and bossy, and I love it, and you're such a gentleman, and I love your cock. His hands slipped under her ass as he groaned, tilting her hips in a way that made her squeal. There's nothing gentlemanly about the way I'm gonna fuck you, sweetheart. She felt a pressure at her entrance, uncomfortable with the uncomfortable with a slight burn, and she had no idea what it could possibly be. He grunted as he thrust, a white-hot pain ripping through her, and she realized it was the thick swell of his shaft that all the bulls at the farm possessed. Too much, too much. You weren't even taking half of him, and it still felt like the biggest thing in the world. Once, twice, a slight shift of her hips, and on the third pump of his hips she moaned, the pain replaced with a pleasure that wiped her vision. When he pulled out, she thought she might scream. Her face pressed to the bed when he flipped her, his oddly angled hips pressing into her form behind. Do you know what happened to the tributes in the labyrinth, Violet? The swollen, streaming head of his of his cock pressed into her on a much smoother glide than it had the first time, dragging against her and stretching her wide, making her pant. They were given to the Minotaur to appease his lust, his insatiable lust that no human man could match. The stretch of his swell, still a burn, a deeper pressure, and then he groaned, bottoming out in her at last. She'd never before been so full, so stuffed, and she was sure the outline of his cock would be visible through her belly, were she not still face down on the bed. They had to send new tributes every year, but the old ones never left. They stayed because they were addicted to the way they were filled. His hips gripped hers, drawing back slowly, addicted to the way they were fucked by the bull. A firm thrust, and then a second, the same solid, steady pounding she'd imagined as he thrust against the bench. With every slam of his hips, she felt his hide-covered skin and bulging thighs, could well imagine the way his wide hooves scraped up against the flooring as he rutted her slowly. Feeling every inch a tribute to the Minotaur, completely addicted to the way he was fucking her. When his heavy balls began to slap against her, she unraveled. I want to feel you come around my cock, Violet. I want you to squeeze me until your pussy has the permanent shape of me, because it's the only cock that's ever gonna make you scream like this again. Alright. Shit. His thrust into her began to take on a sense of urgency as she babbled, grunting as his cock kissed the most sensitive spots inside her.
Yeah, damn. Like, shit. Alright. Shit.
Pounding into her the same way he'd fucked into her hands at the farm. He'd missed his milking, had missed the opportunity to take the edge off his arousal, and tomorrow they could spend all day with soft lovemaking. Inside me, I want you to give me every drop.
It's gonna be a fucking faucet.
When his thick fingers began to stroke circles around her clit, she was finished. His neighbors probably thought someone was being murdered, but she was unable to control the strangled wail that ripped from her throat as her pussy clenched, tears running down her cheeks at how good it was. The first burst within her was a molten wave, the roar in his moan making the room shake as he came. Pulse after pulse of heat, those big...
I don't know, having big balls repeated over and over again is just making me fucking giggle.
Oh no, lost the audio.
Oh, that's not good. I don't know. Anything?